Picture this: a quiet suburban street in Phoenix, Arizona. Children's bicycles on front lawns. The sound of laughter on a Sunday afternoon. Behind one immaculate door, for children, Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai are living their last hours. Their father, a decorated army general, has already made his decision. He's researched the dosages, purchased a one-way ticket to Costa Rica, written the letter that will arrive too late. September 18th, 2023. By evening, all four children are gone, sedated, suffocated, arranged in their beds like they're simply sleeping. When police arrive the next day, they find a crime scene so methodical, so precisely executed, it bears the unmistakable signature of military training. But this wasn't an enemy combatant. This was a father, a man who'd sworn to protect. And his motive? An ultimatum from his pregnant girlfriend. A custody battle. A new life that couldn't include the old one. This is the story of how control became murder. How four lives became obstacles. How a general's calculated decision destroyed a family forever. If you're watching this, you're about to hear one of the most disturbing cases we've ever covered. Before we dive in, do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Cases like these need to be told, need to be remembered, and your support helps us keep bringing these stories to light. All right, let's get into it. Let's start where every nightmare hides, behind a perfect facade. Saguaro Lane in the suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona. If you drove down this street in the summer of 2023, you wouldn't see anything unusual. Well-kept lawns, American flags hanging from porches, the kind of neighborhood where kids ride bikes until the streetlights come on, where everyone waves to each other at the mailbox, where Saturday mornings smell like fresh-cut grass and Sunday afternoons sound like backyard barbecues. Normal, safe, ordinary. The Johnson house sat quietly among the others, a two-story home with a perfectly manicured lawn, no weeds in the flower beds, no toys scattered across the driveway. Everything in its place, everything precisely maintained. If you were a real estate agent, you'd call it immaculate. If you were a neighbor, you might call it impressive. But if you looked closer, if you really paid attention, you might notice something else. Something harder to name. An absence, maybe. The house was too perfect, too controlled. Like a museum exhibit of suburban life rather than the real thing. Inside that house lived four children: Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai Johnson. By all accounts, they were remarkable kids. Otto, the oldest at 10, was fascinated by astronomy. He'd stay up late with his telescope, charting constellations, memorizing planetary orbits, dreaming about discovering new worlds. His teachers said he had the kind of mind that comes along once in a decade, curious, analytical, always asking the next question. Jack, also 10, was a natural athlete. Soccer was his passion, and he'd recently been selected for a competitive youth league, the kind of program that scouts pay attention to. His coach would later say he'd never seen footwork that instinctive in someone so young. Then there was Liam, 9 years old, with a gift for music. He'd been teaching himself piano, practicing for hours until his fingers could dance across the keys, until he could make Beethoven sound effortless. And finally, Kai, the youngest at 8, the only girl. She was an artist, always drawing, always creating. Her sketchbooks were filled with colorful worlds, fantastical creatures, places where, as she once told her mother, everyone is kind and no one is ever alone. Four bright, talented, accomplished children. On paper, they were thriving. But paper doesn't tell you everything. Paper doesn't capture the way Otto's shoulders would tense when his father entered the room. It doesn't record how Jack's smile would falter when he made a mistake on the field and caught his dad's disapproving stare from the sidelines. It doesn't measure the hours Liam practiced in secret, afraid that anything less than perfection would disappoint. And it certainly doesn't reveal the careful, quiet way Kai moved through the house, making herself small, making herself invisible, trying so hard to be good enough. Because behind that perfect facade, life in the Johnson household operated according to a very different set of rules. Rules that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with control. Let's talk about the man who made those rules. Alan Johnson, 46 years old, former Army general. By any conventional measure, his life story reads like an American success narrative, the kind of biography that gets printed in alumni magazines and cited at award ceremonies. He'd served his country for over 20 years, rising through the ranks with what his superiors called tactical brilliance and exceptional leadership abilities. He'd deployed to conflict zones around the world. He'd earned commendations. He'd commanded respect from everyone who served under him. When he retired 2 years before the events of September 2023, he left with honor, with a pension, with a reputation as one of the military's finest strategic minds. But here's the thing about reputations. They're carefully constructed. They're edited versions of reality, highlight reels that leave out everything that doesn't fit the narrative. And Alan Johnson was exceptionally good at constructing narratives. He understood how to present himself, how to project authority and competence, how to make people see exactly what he wanted them to see. In military contexts, this served him well. In personal contexts, it was something else entirely. Colleagues who worked with Johnson described him as charismatic but controlling. He had a way of commanding a room, of making people feel like they were part of something important when they were in his orbit. But that charisma came with conditions. You were valued as long as you performed, as long as you followed the plan, as long as you didn't question, didn't deviate, didn't disrupt the carefully ordered system he'd created. Step out of line, and that warmth disappeared. What replaced it wasn't anger. Anger would have been too human, too emotional. Instead, you got cold distance. A look that made you feel like you'd ceased to matter, like you'd become irrelevant. Lieutenant Colonel Sofia Rivera, who served under Johnson's command for 3 years, would later testify about this dynamic. She described him as someone who could be incredibly charming when he wanted something, someone who inspired loyalty and admiration. But there was always that undercurrent, she said, that rigid expectation. He demanded perfection from his subordinates and would become coldly distant if you disappointed him, she recalled. Several junior officers were reduced to tears after private meetings with him, though he never raised his voice or used inappropriate language. It was his ability to make you feel utterly worthless with just a look or a few precisely chosen words. That assessment, charming but controlling, demanding but cold, wasn't limited to his professional life. It defined his personal life too, especially his approach to marriage and fatherhood. Alan Johnson met Catherine Smith at a military fundraiser in 2005. She was young, ambitious, drawn to his confidence and his stories of service. He was attentive, romantic, the kind of man who seemed to have his life figured out. They married in 2007. For the first year or so, Catherine later recalled, things seemed fine, normal, even. But after their first child, Otto, was born in 2013, something shifted. Alan's carefully controlled life suddenly included a variable he couldn't fully manage: a baby. An unpredictable, emotional, needy human being who didn't follow schedules or respond to commands. Alan's solution? Create systems, protocols, what Catherine would later describe as a military operation approach to parenting. There were feeding schedules, sleep schedules, developmental milestone charts. Everything was tracked, measured, optimized. When Catherine suggested maybe they could be a bit more flexible, maybe respond to Otto's cues rather than the clock, Alan would dismiss her concerns. She was being too soft, he said. Sentiment was inefficient. Children needed structure, discipline, clear expectations. That's how you raise successful people. As more children arrived, Jack in 2013, Liam in 2014, Kai in 2015, the systems became more elaborate. Alan created what he called the Family Operations Manual, a literal 3-ring binder containing detailed protocols for everything from morning routines to bedtime procedures. The children had checklists to complete daily. Their performance was evaluated. Good behavior was rewarded with approval. Mistakes resulted in consequences, push-ups, privileges revoked, carefully calibrated punishments designed to reinforce productive behaviors. Catherine watched this unfold with growing horror. These weren't children being raised. They were recruits being trained. She tried to intervene, tried to provide warmth and spontaneity and unconditional love. But Alan undermined her at every turn, telling the children that their mother's approach was weak, that excellence required discipline, that second place was just the first loser. By 2015, Catherine had no access to their joint bank accounts. Her friends, the ones Alan hadn't approved of, had gradually been cut from her life. She was isolated, financially dependent, and watching her children transform into anxious, achievement-focused little soldiers who seemed to operate according to some predetermined protocol rather than genuine joy or curiosity. When Catherine finally left in early 2016, it was the hardest decision of her life. She wanted to take the children with her, but Alan made his position crystal clear. If she tried, he would destroy her. No judge will award custody to an unemployed housewife over a decorated army officer, he told her. And at that moment, broken and terrified, she believed him. So she left alone, thinking it would be temporary, thinking she'd rebuild her life, establish financial independence, and come back for her children when she was strong enough to fight. But Alan didn't let that happen. He allowed only limited, supervised visits, always on his terms, always under his control. And gradually, those visits became less frequent. By 2020, Catherine only saw the children on major holidays. By 2022, even those visits had stopped. Alan told the children their mother had abandoned them, that she didn't care enough to be part of their lives. He systematically erased her from their world, removing photographs, blocking communications, rewriting their family history so that he was the only parent who mattered. So what did life look like for Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai during these years? From the outside, it looked like success. They attended prestigious schools. They excelled academically. They were involved in multiple extracurricular activities, astronomy clubs, competitive sports leagues, music lessons, art programs. Their report cards were immaculate. Their achievements were impressive. If you judged by conventional metrics, these children were thriving. But look closer. Talk to their teachers, their coaches, the few adults who spent time with them outside their father's direct supervision. A different picture emerges. Grace Peters, the family's nanny from 2017 to 2022, would later describe the household as operating like a military installation. The children followed a strict schedule posted in every room. Wake at 0600 hours. Breakfast by 0630. School preparation by 0700. Everything was timed, structured, monitored. Free play was limited to designated 45-minute blocks, and even then, activities had to be constructive and developmentally appropriate according to his standards. Peters recalled an incident that particularly troubled her. Otto had been selected for a special astronomy program that met on Wednesday evenings, a dream opportunity for a kid obsessed with the stars. But it conflicted with the family's mandatory dinner time. When Otto asked if he could attend, Alan initially refused. Routine was non-negotiable, he said. Otto persisted, showing unusual courage in standing up to his father. The result? His astronomy books and telescope were confiscated for a month. What disturbed me most, Peters testified, was that the general showed no anger during this interaction. He was coldly logical, explaining to Otto that discipline is maintained through consistent consequences, not emotional responses. Teachers noticed similar patterns. The Johnson children were exceptionally well-behaved, almost unnaturally so. They didn't roughhouse. They didn't talk back. They responded to adults with yes, sir, and yes, ma'am. One teacher described them as having a military-like discipline that seemed at odds with their young ages. Another noted concerns about their limited peer interactions and what she called an almost palpable anxiety about making mistakes or failing to meet expectations. Diane Martinez, a neighbor who lived next door for 3 years, rarely saw spontaneous play or affection in the Johnson household. The children were always immaculately dressed, perfectly behaved, involved in numerous structured activities, she recalled. But I rarely saw them just being kids. When they played in the backyard, it was always during designated time slots with specific educational toys or sports equipment. And Alan would often observe from the patio, taking notes on what appeared to be a performance evaluation form. She remembered overhearing Alan reprimand Otto for receiving a B+ on a science project instead of an A. His voice was calm, controlled, frightening in its lack of emotion. Failure to achieve excellence is a choice, he told his 10-year-old son. Second place is simply the first loser. This was the environment Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai grew up in. Not violent, not physically abusive in any conventional sense, but emotionally sterile. Achievement-focused to the point of suffocation. A home where love was conditional, where approval had to be earned through performance, where mistakes were unacceptable and vulnerability was weakness. Now, you might be wondering, didn't anyone intervene? Didn't anyone see the red flags and do something? The answer is complicated. Because here's the thing about cases like this. When everything looks perfect on paper, When children are well-fed and well-dressed and high-achieving, when there are no visible bruises or obvious neglect, the system doesn't know what to do. Alan Johnson's sister, Samantha, actually called Child Protective Services anonymously after visiting the family at Christmas 2020. She'd watched her niece and nephew move through the house, like shadows, she said. Polite, accomplished, but without the spark or joy you expect in children. But when CPS investigated, what did they find? A clean home, children enrolled in prestigious schools, plenty of food in the refrigerator, involvement in enriching activities. Everything looked fine. Better than fine, actually. Exemplary. What the investigators couldn't measure was the emotional climate, the complete absence of spontaneous love or comfort, the rigid control that governed every aspect of the children's lives. On paper, Alan Johnson was a model single father, sacrificing his career to provide stability for his kids after their mother abandoned them. That was the narrative, and it was convincing. So life in the Johnson household continued its carefully controlled rhythm. Otto studied his astronomy texts and dreamed of planets he'd never name. Jack perfected his soccer skills and learned to hide his mistakes. Liam practiced piano in secret, terrified of playing anything less than perfectly. Kai filled her sketchbooks with colorful fantasy worlds where everyone was kind and no one was alone. And Alan maintained his iron grip on their lives, convinced that his approach, his protocols, his discipline, his systematic elimination of chaos and emotion was preparing them for success. But something was about to disrupt that carefully constructed order. Actually, two things. First, in late August 2023, Catherine filed for emergency custody review. After 7 years of trying to rebuild her life, trying to establish financial stability, she was finally ready to fight for her children. She'd seen them briefly at a grocery store in July, thin, exhausted, pulling away from her before they could talk, and something broke inside her. She couldn't wait any longer. She contacted a family law attorney and initiated legal proceedings. Second, and perhaps more significantly, Alan Johnson had a secret. A relationship he'd been keeping carefully compartmentalized, separate from his children, his public life, his carefully controlled existence. Her name was Rachel Thomas. She was 28 years old. She worked under him at Meridian Defense Systems, where he'd been employed as a senior consultant since his military retirement. And in July 2023, she discovered she was pregnant with his child. For a man whose entire identity was built around control, these two developments represented something he couldn't tolerate, variables he couldn't eliminate, complications he couldn't manage, threats to the carefully ordered system he'd spent years constructing. And in Alan Johnson's mind, problems required solutions. Obstacles required elimination. The simple mathematics of the situation, as he would later write in his journal, were becoming unavoidable. For lives anchored to a failed past, two lives representing unlimited future potential. When you frame it that way, when you reduce human beings to equations, the correct path becomes terrifyingly clear. September 19, 2023. A Tuesday morning in Phoenix, Arizona. The kind of day that starts with clear blue skies and the promise of temperatures climbing into the 90s by afternoon. For most people on Saguaro Lane, it was just another ordinary day, coffee brewing, kids getting ready for school, the usual rhythm of suburban life. But at the Johnson house, something was terribly wrong. The lights were off. The car was in the driveway. And nobody was answering the door. Catherine Smith hadn't slept the night before. She'd been staring at a certified letter that arrived in her mailbox the previous afternoon, postmarked September 17th from Phoenix. 7 words, written in Alan's precise, controlled handwriting. You'll never get them back. That's it. No explanation. No context. Just those 7 words that hit her like a physical blow. She'd immediately tried calling the house phone. No answer. She'd tried Alan's cell. Straight to voicemail. She'd sent texts, emails, everything. Nothing. By 3 in the morning, when panic had fully set in, she knew something was catastrophically wrong. At 6 a.m., she called the Phoenix Police Department and requested a welfare check. The call came into dispatch around 6:47 a.m. routine stuff, or so it seemed. Concerned ex-wife. Can't reach her kids or her ex-husband. Worried something might be wrong. Officers were dispatched to 2847 Saguaro Lane to check on the welfare of 4 juvenile residents. When Officers Martinez and Chun pulled up to the Johnson residence around 7:15 a.m., Nothing looked immediately suspicious. Well-maintained property. No signs of forced entry. No visible disturbance. Officer Martinez knocked on the front door. No response. He knocked again, louder this time, identifying himself. Still nothing. He walked around the perimeter, peering through windows. The house was dark inside, curtains drawn, but everything looked orderly. Too orderly, maybe. Too still. That's when Martinez noticed something. The back door, it wasn't locked. Just slightly ajar, like someone had left in a hurry and hadn't pulled it shut properly. He called out again, announcing their presence, giving whoever might be inside every opportunity to respond. Silence. He and Shin exchanged glances. That feeling you get when your instincts start screaming that something's very wrong. They entered the house, calling out as they moved through the first floor. Kitchen, immaculate, everything in its place. Living room, spotless, like a furniture showroom. No signs of struggle. No obvious disturbance. But also no people. No sounds. Just an eerie, heavy quiet that made the air feel thick. Then they went upstairs. And that's when a routine welfare check became something else entirely. The first bedroom they entered belonged to Kai, the youngest. 8 years old. Officer Martinez would later say that for just a split second, he thought she was sleeping. She was in her bed, covers pulled up neatly to her chin, her favorite stuffed elephant tucked beside her pillow. Her room was perfectly organized, toys on shelves, books stacked neatly, drawings arranged on her desk. Everything peaceful, everything calm. Except when Martinez approached the bed and said her name, she didn't stir. When he reached out to check for a pulse, her skin was cold to the touch. Unnaturally cold. And her face, beneath the careful arrangement, showed the telltale signs of lividity. She'd been dead for hours. Officer Chin immediately called for backup and medical response, his voice tight with controlled urgency as he radioed in what they'd found. But they both knew what they were going to discover in the other bedrooms. 3 more rooms. 3 more children. Liam, 9 years old, in his bed with a music box on his nightstand. Jack, 10 years old, positioned almost identically to his sister, with his soccer medal placed carefully beside his pillow. And finally, Otto, also 10, with his astronomy textbook laid open next to him, as if he'd been reading before falling asleep. All 4 children. All cold. All arranged with the same careful precision. Each in their own bed. Each with their favorite comfort item placed beside them. Each positioned as though they were simply sleeping. Except they weren't sleeping. They were dead. And the scene, the methodical arrangement, the lack of struggle, the almost ritualistic positioning, told a story that made Martinez's blood run cold. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't some tragic mishap or sudden illness. This was planned, deliberate, executed with military precision. Within minutes, the house was swarming with emergency responders. Paramedics confirmed what the officers already knew. All 4 children had been deceased for approximately 12 to 15 hours, putting time of death somewhere between 7 p.m. and 10 p.m. the previous evening. Detective Noah Martinez arrived at the scene around 8:30 a.m. He was a 15-year veteran of the Phoenix Police Department's Homicide Division, someone who'd seen his share of terrible things. But walking through that house, seeing those 4 children laid out like that, it hit him differently. There was something especially disturbing about the care that had been taken. The positioning, the comfort items, the blankets tucked just so. Whoever did this wanted them to look peaceful, wanted them to appear as though they'd simply drifted off to sleep and never woken up. No signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds on any of the children. The house itself was immaculate, not the kind of clean you get from a quick tidying up, but the kind of sterile organization that suggests obsessive control. In the kitchen, Detective Martinez found 4 empty juice glasses in the sink, rinsed but not washed. Later analysis would reveal trace amounts of benzodiazepines and diphenhydramine, a combination of prescription sedatives and over-the-counter sleep aids. The children had been drugged before they were killed. They'd been rendered unconscious so they wouldn't struggle, wouldn't resist, wouldn't even know what was happening to them. And their father, Alan Johnson? Nowhere to be found. His car was in the garage, but there was no sign of him anywhere in the house. His bedroom looked like it had been carefully packed, closet partially emptied, drawers left open, personal items clearly removed. This wasn't someone who'd fled in panic. This was someone who'd left according to plan. As the crime scene investigation got underway, Detective Martinez began piecing together what had happened and, more urgently, where Alan Johnson had gone. The first major break came from the letter Catherine Smith had received, the one that had prompted her to call for the welfare check in the first place. "You'll never get them back." 7 words that suddenly carried horrifying weight. The envelope was postmarked September 17th, a full day before the estimated time of death, which meant Alan had mailed that letter before killing his children. He'd known what he was going to do. He'd planned it. And he'd wanted Catherine to know, eventually, that he'd kept his promise from years earlier. If she tried to take the children away from him, she'd never see them again. Forensics would later confirm that the handwriting matched samples from Alan's military personnel files and personal documents found in the house. But even without that confirmation, Martinez knew. The precision of the letter, the timing, the calculated cruelty of it. It all fit the profile of someone who approached even murder like a military operation. Clear objective. Methodical execution. No room for emotion or second-guessing. The next piece of the puzzle came from Alan's home office. Detectives found a desktop computer, still powered on. The screen dark, but the hard drive ready to tell its story. What they discovered when they began examining his digital footprint was damning beyond belief. Browser history showing searches for undetectable sedatives, painless death for children, countries without extradition treaties with the United States, and how long after death can police determine time of death. These searches went back weeks, some as far as early August, but intensifying dramatically in the days leading up to September 18th. His digital calendar was particularly chilling. September 18th had been meticulously scheduled. For 30 p.m., final preparations. 5 p.m., dinner with medication. 7 p.m., begin protocol. 10 p.m., verification complete. 11 p.m., finalize travel arrangements. Clinical. Detached. Like planning a business meeting rather than the murder of your own children. The word protocol kept appearing in his notes and journals, a military term for established procedures. He'd turned the killing of his children into a standard operating procedure. Financial records told another story, one of careful preparation for flight. Bank statements showed that Alan had been liquidating assets since July, selling investments, withdrawing large sums of cash, transferring money to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Belize. By mid-September, he'd converted approximately $1.7 million into liquid assets. Detectives also found documentation for a property purchase in Costa Rica, completed through a shell corporation that obscured direct connection to Alan Johnson. And here's the kicker. Costa Rica has no extradition treaty with the United States. Alan hadn't just planned the murders. He'd planned his escape, down to choosing a country where American law couldn't touch him. But the most critical piece of information came from airline records. Alan Johnson had purchased a one-way ticket to San Jose, Costa Rica, scheduled to depart from Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport at 6:45 p.m. on September 20th, just 2 days after the murders. He'd paid in cash, booked under his real name, and requested a seat that would allow for quick deplaning. The man was methodical to a fault, confident that by the time anyone discovered what he'd done, he'd be untouchable in a country that wouldn't send him back. Detective Martinez immediately contacted airport security and immigration officials. If Alan Johnson was planning to flee the country, they had approximately 36 hours to find him before he boarded that plane and disappeared forever. The hunt for Alan Johnson became the Phoenix Police Department's top priority. An all-points bulletin went out across Arizona and neighboring states. His photograph, a formal military portrait showing a stern-faced man in dress uniform, was distributed to every law enforcement agency in the Southwest. His vehicle, a silver Toyota Camry registered in his name, was found parked in a long-term lot at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport. He'd driven himself there, which meant he was already in the area, likely holed up somewhere until his flight departure. Airport security began monitoring all terminals, particularly international gates. Immigration officials were briefed to flag any boarding passes issued to Alan Johnson. Detectives worked their phones, contacting every known associate, every former colleague, anyone who might have information about where he'd go or what his plan might be. But Alan Johnson had been careful. He'd compartmentalized his life so thoroughly that even people who thought they knew him had no idea he'd been planning something like this. Then came a crucial lead. Phone records from Alan's cell revealed frequent contact with a number belonging to someone named Rachel Thomas. The calls had been ongoing for months, but there'd been a noticeable spike in frequency and duration starting in early September, culminating in a 47-minute call on the evening of September 17th, the night before the murders. Detectives tracked down Rachel Thomas's information. 28 years old, administrative assistant at Meridian Defense Systems, the defense contractor where Alan had worked since his military retirement. They brought her in for questioning on the afternoon of September 19th, and what she told them added a whole new dimension to the case. Rachel and Alan had been in a relationship for approximately 10 months. She believed he was divorced, a single father raising 4 children on his own. She'd never met the children. Alan always claimed they needed more time to adjust before he introduced someone new into their lives. But the relationship had been serious enough that when Rachel discovered she was pregnant in July, she told him, expecting. Well, she wasn't sure what she'd expected. But Alan's reaction had been strange. First, cold distance, suggesting she consider termination. Then, a sudden shift, talking about fresh starts, tropical locations, new beginnings. He'd become fixated on Costa Rica, sending her property listings, talking about a life where they could leave everything behind. But Rachel had started to realize something was wrong. Alan was secretive about his living situation, vague about his finances, evasive when she asked basic questions about their future together. By early September, she'd reached her breaking point. On September 15th, she'd sent him a text message, "I can't do this anymore, Alan. If you don't fix your situation by the 18th, I'm getting the abortion and moving back to Denver. This is your last chance. Fix your situation by the 18th. Rachel would later insist, tears streaming down her face during her testimony, that she'd meant for him to be honest with her, to introduce her to his children, to make concrete plans for their future together. She'd meant integration, not elimination. She'd meant truth, not tragedy. But Alan Johnson, it seemed, had interpreted her ultimatum very differently. In his mind, apparently, his situation wasn't his relationship status or his living arrangements. His situation was his 4 children, the obstacles, as he'd written in his journals, standing between him and the fresh start he wanted with Rachel. The 18th, September 18th, the same date he'd scheduled in his digital calendar under Begin Protocol. The same evening he'd sedated his children and suffocated them one by one, from youngest to oldest, according to the medical examiner's later findings. Kai first, then Liam, then Jack, then Otto, each approximately 20 to 30 minutes apart. Methodical, efficient, military precision applied to the murder of his own children. Detective Martinez now had his motive. Alan Johnson had been faced with a choice, or at least, he perceived it as a choice. On one side, his 4 existing children, whom he'd come to view as burdens and complications. On the other side, Rachel Thomas, her pregnancy, and the promise of a new life where he could start over, unencumbered by the responsibilities and imperfections of his current family. And when Rachel gave him a deadline, fix your situation by the 18th, he'd made his decision. He'd chosen the new life, and he'd eliminated the obstacles standing in his way. But there was still the matter of actually finding him. September 19th stretched into evening. The media had gotten wind of the story. 4 children found dead in their Phoenix home, their father missing and wanted for questioning. The case was making headlines. Tips started coming in, most of them useless, some well-meaning but unhelpful. The pressure was mounting. Every hour that passed was another hour Alan Johnson could use to change his plans, ditch his ticket, find another way out of the country. Then, on the evening of September 20th, the day of his scheduled flight, immigration officials at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport spotted him. Terminal 4, International Departures. He was early, arriving at the airport nearly 3 hours before his 6:45 p.m. flight. He'd checked in online, had a carry-on bag, and nothing else. When airport security approached him, he didn't run, didn't resist, just stood there, calm and composed, and asked if he could retrieve his luggage. Like he was mildly inconvenienced rather than about to be arrested for the murder of his 4 children. Detective Martinez was called to the airport immediately. When he arrived and informed Alan Johnson that he was being arrested for 4 counts of first-degree murder, Alan's response was unervingly controlled. No shock, no denial, no emotion whatsoever. He simply nodded and said he wanted to speak with his attorney. That was it. The man who'd just murdered his 4 children, who'd sedated and suffocated them one by one, who'd arranged their bodies like they were sleeping and then tried to flee to a non-extradition country. He showed no visible remorse, no breakdown, no human reaction to being confronted with his crimes. Inside Allen's carry-on bag, officers found exactly what they expected: $50,000 in cash, a passport, a new prepaid phone with no call history, and several journals that would later provide investigators with disturbing insights into his mindset in the weeks and days leading up to the murders. There were also printouts of Costa Rican property laws, a deed to the remote property he'd purchased, Spanish-language instruction materials, and a folder labeled New Start containing bank account information for accounts opened under a slightly altered name, Allen Jenkins instead of Allen Johnson. He'd planned everything, every detail, every contingency, everything except getting caught before his flight departed. And even now, in custody, facing the worst charges imaginable, Allen Johnson maintained that eerie, unsettling calm. Like this was all just a temporary setback in an otherwise well-executed operation. Back at the Johnson house, the crime scene investigation continued into the night. The medical examiner, Dr. Layla Patel, had arrived to oversee the removal of the children's bodies. It's a process that's clinical by necessity, documenting positions, taking photographs, collecting evidence. But there's no way to completely detach from the human tragedy of it. For children, for lives ended before they'd barely begun. Dr. Patel would later testify about the specific cause of death: asphyxiation, most likely by smothering with a pillow or similar soft object, preceded by sedation that would have rendered them unconscious. They wouldn't have struggled, wouldn't have suffered in any conventional sense. They'd simply gone to sleep and never woken up. Allen had apparently believed this made his actions merciful, less cruel somehow. But mercy implies benevolence, compassion, a desire to alleviate suffering. What Allen had done wasn't mercy. It was elimination. Cold, calculated removal of people he'd come to see as problems rather than human beings. Outside the house, a crowd had begun to gather. Neighbors who'd heard the news, reporters setting up cameras, curious onlookers drawn by the police presence and crime scene tape. And then, slowly, spontaneously, something else began to appear. Stuffed animals, flowers, candles, children's drawings. People from the community, most of whom had never met the Johnson children, started creating a makeshift memorial on the front lawn. Blue was chosen as the memorial color. 4 blue balloons tied to the mailbox, blue ribbons pinned to teddy bears, blue candles flickering in the gathering darkness. Catherine Smith arrived at the house around 9 p.m., escorted by victim advocates from the police department. She'd been the one to call for the welfare check. She'd been the one to sound the alarm. And now she stood on the sidewalk, staring at the house where her children had died, unable to go inside, unable to look away. A reporter would later describe her expression as shattered. That's the word they used. Shattered. Like something fundamental inside her had broken beyond repair. Because here's what Catherine was living with. She'd left those children 7 years ago. She'd made the impossible choice to leave them with Allen because she'd believed his threats, believed she couldn't win a custody battle against a decorated military officer. She'd spent 7 years rebuilding her life, saving money, preparing to fight for them. And she'd finally done it. Filed for emergency custody review in late August. Finally gathered the courage and resources to try to get her children back. But she'd been too late. Just weeks too late. And now they were gone. Not taken from her by a judge or a custody agreement. Taken from her, from everyone, by the man who'd promised, years earlier, that if she tried to fight him, she'd never see them again. You'll never get them back. That letter, those 7 words. He'd kept his promise. In the most horrific, permanent way imaginable. The Phoenix community reacted with shock and grief. The story dominated local news. Decorated general arrested for murder of 4 children. It was incomprehensible. How does a man spend 20 years serving his country, earning commendations and respect, rising to the rank of general, and then do something like this? How does a father, someone who's supposed to protect and nurture, look at his own children and see obstacles to be eliminated? The disconnect between Allen Johnson's public persona and his private actions was staggering. And as more details emerged, the planning, the research, the journals describing his children as anchors and complications, the horror only deepened. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't a moment of mental breakdown or temporary insanity. This was premeditated murder, carried out with the same tactical precision Allen had once applied to military operations. He'd identified a problem, developed a solution, executed the plan, and attempted to extract himself from the situation without consequences. But now, Alan Johnson sat in a county jail cell, facing 4 counts of first-degree murder. And ahead of him lay a legal process that would expose every ugly detail of what he'd done, why he'd done it, and who he really was beneath that carefully constructed facade of military honor and parental responsibility. Alan Johnson's arrest at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport on the evening of September 20th, 2023, marked the beginning of what would become one of the most scrutinized criminal investigations in Arizona history. But before we dive into the courtroom drama, we need to understand just how meticulously this man had planned his escape. Because what investigators found in the hours and days following his arrest painted a picture of someone who'd been orchestrating his getaway for months. Someone who genuinely believed he could murder 4 children and simply disappear into a new life as if the old one had never existed. Let's start with what was found in Alan's carry-on bag when he was detained at the airport. $50,000 in cash. Not bundled haphazardly, but organized in neat stacks, separated into different currencies. US dollars, yes, but also Costa Rican colones already exchanged and ready to use upon arrival. His passport, obviously, but also a folder containing multiple forms of identification, backup credit cards under slightly altered names, and even a social security card that forensic analysis would later reveal as fraudulent. This wasn't someone grabbing essentials in a panic. This was someone who'd been methodically preparing for this moment. Then there were the journals. 3 leather-bound notebooks, the kind you might use for professional planning or personal reflection. Except these weren't filled with mundane thoughts or work notes. These journals documented Alan Johnson's psychological descent, or, more accurately, his calculated rationalization, over the months leading up to September 18th. Detective Martinez would later describe reading through these pages as one of the most disturbing experiences of his career. Not because they were filled with rage or incoherence, but because they were so calm, so logical, so terrifyingly methodical in their progression from viewing his children as responsibilities to viewing them as obstacles that needed to be eliminated. The earliest entries, from around March 2023, read like standard parenting frustrations. Concerns about the children's performance in various activities. Notes about their behavior. Observations about their development. Nothing that would raise immediate alarm. But by June, after Alan had learned about Rachel's pregnancy, the tone began to shift. The children were no longer described as individuals. Otto with his love of astronomy, Jack with his soccer skills, Liam with his music. Instead, they became collective. The 4. The complications. The anchors. Language that dehumanized them, that reduced them from people to problems. One entry from July 15th, 2023, just weeks after Rachel had told him about the pregnancy, read, "Increased sense that current obligations are incompatible with future possibilities." The 4 represents stagnation, endless repetition of the same duties without advancement or evolution. R represents forward movement, clean slate, opportunity to approach fatherhood differently this time. The mathematics of the situation becoming clearer. Mathematics. That word appears repeatedly in Alan's journals. He's taking human relationships, parental bonds, the lives of his own children, and reducing them to equations. Variables to be calculated. Problems to be solved with logic rather than emotion. But the journals weren't just philosophical musings about his dissatisfaction with his current life. They were planning documents. By August, the entries started including concrete details. On August 3rd, research property opportunities in Costa Rica. Non-extradition status confirmed. Climate favorable. English widely spoken in expat communities. Could establish new identity without significant difficulty. August 12th, began liquidating investment portfolio. Must be methodical to avoid raising suspicion with financial institutions. Target completion, early September. August 19th, are becoming impatient about timeline and clarity. Asked directly about the children and how they factor into our future. Avoided specifics. Need to manage her expectations while finalizing arrangements. She doesn't understand the complexity of transition planning. Transition planning, that's what he called it. Like he was changing jobs, not plotting to murder his children. The clinical detachment is what makes these entries so chilling. There's no struggle in his words. No internal conflict. No moment where he questions whether what he's considering is monstrous. It's all just logistics. September 1st, Catherine filed for emergency custody review. Timing could not be worse. Legal proceedings would complicate timelines significantly, cannot allow disruption to established plans. This is the entry where Alan explicitly acknowledges that his ex-wife's custody filing posed a threat to his escape timeline. Not a threat to his children's well-being or his relationship with them, but a threat to his plans. The subtext is clear. He needed to act before the custody hearing could proceed, before a judge could potentially award Catherine partial or full custody, before his control over the situation could be challenged legally. September 10th is when things get explicitly dark. A simple equation has formed in my mind. 4 lives weighed against 2. The simple math of the situation becomes clearer each day. The 4 represent the past with all its failures and limitations. The 2 represent the future, unburdened and full of potential. When framed logically, the correct path becomes unavoidable. 4 lives weighed against 2. He's talking about his children like they're numbers on a balance sheet. The 2 he's referring to are himself and Rachel, or possibly Rachel and her unborn child. Either way, the implication is the same. His existing children are expendable when measured against his desired future. The September 15th entry is particularly significant because it corresponds with Rachel Thomas's ultimatum text. "I can't do this anymore, Alan. If you don't fix your situation by the 18th, I'm getting the abortion and moving back to Denver. This is your last chance." In his journal that evening, Alan wrote, "Our issued ultimatum today. Deadline, September 18th. Fix your situation or lose the opportunity." She doesn't realize she's just provided the final piece of justification. The timeline is now non-negotiable. The 18th will be the transition date. Fix your situation. Rachel would later testify, devastated and guilt-ridden, that she meant he should be honest with her, introduce her to his children, integrate his life rather than compartmentalizing everything. But Alan interpreted it, or chose to interpret it, as permission to eliminate the situation. His children were the situation, and his solution was to make them cease to exist. The September 17th entry, the day before the murders, is the most haunting. Tomorrow brings resolution. The 4 will be at peace, free from the coming custody battle and Catherine's manipulations. The letter has been sent. She'll understand eventually that this was the only merciful solution. By the time she receives it, the transition will be complete, and within 48 hours, R and I will begin our new life where none can follow or judge. The protocol is established, the timeline confirmed, the necessary materials prepared. There is a strange calm in finally accepting the inevitable mathematics of the situation. Protocol, materials, timeline. He's writing about murdering his children using military terminology, as if he's planning a tactical operation rather than committing an unspeakable atrocity. And that phrase, "the 4 will be at peace," reveals his twisted rationalization. He's convinced himself, or at least he's trying to convince himself, that he's doing them a favor, sparing them from future suffering. It's a delusion, of course, a grotesque distortion of reality that allows him to avoid confronting what he's actually doing. But here's what makes Alan's planning even more calculated. The journals weren't just found in his carry-on bag. Additional notebooks were discovered hidden in his home office, encrypted files on his computer that required digital forensics experts to access, and even a safety deposit box at a local bank that contained backup documentation for his Costa Rica property, additional cash reserves, and detailed instructions he'd apparently written for himself about establishing a new identity abroad. Let's talk about the digital evidence, because this is where Alan's military intelligence background really shows. The man knew how to cover his tracks, or at least, he thought he did. His browser history had been cleared multiple times using professional-grade software designed to prevent recovery. But here's the thing about digital forensics. Nothing is ever truly gone. Aidan Park, the digital forensics expert assigned to the case, was able to recover significant portions of Alan's search history going back months, and what he found was damning beyond belief. The searches started innocuously enough in June. General queries about Costa Rica, property prices, cost of living, visa requirements. By July, they'd progressed to more specific topics: countries without extradition treaties, how to create offshore bank accounts, establishing new identity in foreign country. Then in August, after Catherine filed for custody review, the searches took a darker turn. Can custody proceedings be stopped by relocation, international child custody enforcement, and tellingly, what happens to custody case if children are deceased? That last search, think about what it means. Alan was researching in mid-August, a full month before the murders. What would happen to Catherine's custody filing if the children died? He was already considering it, already gaming out the scenario, already treating his children's potential deaths as a strategic solution to a legal problem. But the most disturbing searches came in early September, right around the time Rachel issued her ultimatum. September 16th, just 2 days before the murders, untraceable sedatives, dosage calculations for children 40 to 60 pounds. How long does it take to suffocate? Can asphyxiation be detected in autopsy? Peaceful death while sleeping? And do unconscious victims feel pain during suffocation? He was researching how to kill them painlessly. And if you're thinking, well, at least he wanted them not to suffer, let me stop you right there. This wasn't compassion. This was tactical planning. Alan wasn't concerned about his children's well-being. He was concerned about execution efficiency and minimizing physical evidence. The sedation wasn't mercy, it was method. It ensured they wouldn't struggle, wouldn't fight back, wouldn't create a scene that would be harder to stage as peaceful. The financial paper trail was equally meticulous. Forensic accountant Maya Patel spent weeks tracing Alan's monetary movements, and what she discovered revealed a man who'd been preparing for this escape for months. Starting in July 2023, Alan began systematically liquidating his assets. Investment accounts were closed. Stocks were sold. His 401k from his military service was cashed out early, despite significant tax penalties. By September, he'd converted approximately $1.7 million into liquid, movable assets. But here's where it gets interesting. Alan didn't just withdraw all this money and stuff it in a mattress. He was sophisticated about it. Money was transferred through multiple accounts to obscure the trail. Some went to offshore banks in the Cayman Islands and Belize, jurisdictions known for banking secrecy and minimal cooperation with U.S. law enforcement. Other amounts were converted to cryptocurrency, which he apparently believed would be untraceable. And significant cash amounts were distributed across multiple safety deposit boxes in different banks across Phoenix, so that no single large withdrawal would trigger automatic reporting requirements. The Costa Rica property purchase alone cost $340,000, paid through a shell corporation registered in Panama called Nuevos Comienzos Holdings LLC. Nuevos Comienzos, Spanish for new beginnings. Even the company name reflected his mindset. This was all about starting over, wiping the slate clean, moving forward unburdened by the complications of his current life. Complications that happened to be 4 living, breathing children. Detective Martinez also discovered that Alan had opened a bank account in Costa Rica under the name Alan Jenkins, same first name, slightly altered surname. Close enough that he could probably claim it was just a clerical error if questioned, but different enough to create plausible distance from his legal identity. The account had been funded with $50,000 transferred from one of his offshore accounts. He'd even obtained a Costa Rican driver's license using forged documentation, complete with his photo under the Jenkins name. This wasn't amateur hour. This was a man who'd spent his entire career in military intelligence, who understood operational security, who knew how to plan complex operations and execute them successfully. He'd applied those same skills to planning and executing the murder of his own children and his subsequent disappearance. The flight itself, Aerosur Airlines, Flight 847 to San Jose, had been booked on September 16th, 2 days before the murders. One-way ticket, business class, paid in cash at a travel agency rather than online, presumably to avoid leaving a digital trail connected to his credit cards. The ticket agent, Melissa Huang, would later testify that Alan had been very specific about his seat selection, aisle seat in the front of the business class cabin, which would allow him to deplane quickly upon arrival. He'd asked about customs procedures in Costa Rica, about visa requirements for extended stays, about the best way to exchange currency. All very normal questions for an international traveler. Except this traveler was planning to flee justice for quadruple homicide. When airport security detained Alan on September 20th, he was early for his flight, arriving nearly 3 hours before scheduled departure. Why so early? Investigators believe he wanted maximum time to observe the airport, to ensure there was no heightened security presence, to abort the plan if necessary and find alternative escape routes. Even in the final moments, he was being tactical, careful, controlled. The security footage from the airport that day is eerie to watch. Alan Johnson moving through the terminal with his single carry-on bag, his posture perfect, his movements measured and deliberate. He buys a coffee, sits in the departure lounge, appears to be reading something on his phone. To any casual observer, he's just another business traveler heading to Costa Rica. You'd never know he'd murdered 4 children less than 48 hours earlier. There's no nervous fidgeting, no looking over his shoulder, no visible signs of stress or guilt. Just calm, controlled composure. When immigration officials and airport police approached him, witness accounts describe his reaction as almost unnervingly cooperative. Detective Martinez arrived at the airport around 40 minutes after Alan's detention. He'd been waiting for this moment since discovering those 4 children in their beds the previous morning. Walking into that interrogation room, looking across the table at Alan Johnson in his business casual attire, still wearing that expression of calm detachment, Martinez later said it took every ounce of his professional training not to react emotionally. "Mr. Johnson," Martinez began, "I'm Detective Noah Martinez with Phoenix PD Homicide Division. You're being arrested for 4 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai Johnson." Alan's response? He nodded, once, then said, "I'd like to speak with my attorney." That was it. No, what are you talking about? No denial. No shock or confusion or any of the reactions you'd expect from an innocent person being accused of murdering their own children. Just a calm assertion of his Fifth Amendment rights. Because Alan Johnson knew exactly what he'd done, and he'd already prepared for this possibility. He'd probably run through this scenario in his mind dozens of times, gaming out what he'd say, how he'd respond, what his legal strategy would be if he was caught before escaping the country. The initial interrogation was brief. Alan invoked his right to remain silent almost immediately and requested legal representation. But that didn't stop investigators from cataloging everything found in his possession. The cash, the fake IDs, the journals, the documentation for his Costa Rica property, the prepaid phone that had no call history but was clearly intended for use once he'd established himself abroad. Even a small notebook containing what appeared to be a checklist. Accounts closed, yes. Property secured, yes. Documentation prepared, yes. Transition complete, yes. Flight confirmed, yes. Transition complete. He'd actually checked that box. As if the murder of his 4 children was just another task to complete on his way to a new life. Perhaps most chilling was a document found encrypted on a thumb drive in his carry-on bag. It was titled Protocol and contained detailed, step-by-step instructions Alan had apparently written for himself. How much sedative to administer based on body weight. How long to wait after sedation before proceeding to next phase, his words. How to position the bodies afterward. How to clean up. How to verify completion. It read like a military operations manual, except the operation was familicide. As news of Alan's arrest spread, the Phoenix community erupted in a mixture of relief and horror. Relief that he'd been caught before escaping the country. Horror at the depth of planning and calculation that had gone into his crimes. The media descended on the story with full force. Former general arrested in murder of 4 children. Decorated war veteran planned escape to Costa Rica after killing kids. Military hero or family killer. The double life of Alan Johnson. That last headline captures something important. The cognitive dissonance people felt trying to reconcile Alan's public persona with his private actions. This was a man who'd served his country with distinction, who'd been entrusted with command over soldiers' lives, who'd received medals for valor and leadership. How does that person become someone who murders his own children? How do those two realities exist in the same human being? The answer, uncomfortable as it is, lies in understanding that the same traits that made Alan Johnson an effective military officer, his ability to compartmentalize, to prioritize objectives over emotions, to make calculated decisions under pressure, to execute plans with precision. Those same traits, when twisted by narcissism and rigid control needs, made him capable of viewing his children as acceptable losses in pursuit of his desired outcome. He'd spent 20 years learning how to identify targets, neutralize threats, achieve objectives through strategic planning and tactical execution. And when his children became obstacles to his future with Rachel, he He simply applied those same skills in the most horrific way imaginable. The military hadn't made him a killer, but it had given him the toolkit to be an exceptionally efficient one when he decided his children needed to be eliminated. Outside the Maricopa County Jail where Alan was being held, the memorial for Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai continued to grow. Blue balloons tied to the fence, stuffed animals, children's books, handwritten notes from community members who'd never met these children but felt compelled to honor their lost potential. You deserved better. You were loved. May you find peace. Catherine Smith released a brief statement through her attorney. No words can express the depth of my grief or the horror of what has happened. My children deserved a lifetime of love, joy, and possibility. Instead, they were taken by the one person who should have protected them above all others. I will spend the rest of my life ensuring their memories are honored and that justice is served. Rachel Thomas, visibly pregnant and emotionally devastated, also released a statement. I am heartbroken beyond words. I never imagined, never for a moment believed, that my request for honesty would be interpreted as permission for violence. I will carry the weight of this tragedy for the rest of my life. My heart breaks for Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai, and for their mother who loved them and fought to protect them. And Alan Johnson? He sat in his jail cell, awaiting his first court appearance, still maintaining that eerie calm that would become his trademark throughout the legal proceedings to come. A man who'd planned the perfect escape, except for the part where he got caught. To understand why Alan Johnson did what he did, we need to talk about Rachel Thomas. Not because she bears any responsibility for his actions. Let's be crystal clear about that from the start. But because in Alan's twisted logic, she became the symbol of everything he wanted but couldn't have while his old life still existed. Rachel represented freedom, a fresh start, a chance to be a different version of himself. And when she gave him a deadline, when she demanded clarity and honesty, Alan's compartmentalized world began to collapse. The question is, how did a 28-year-old administrative assistant become entangled with a man who would ultimately murder his 4 children in pursuit of the future she represented? Rachel Thomas started working at Meridian Defense Systems in January 2023. It was her first professional job out of college. She'd spent her early 20s working retail and service jobs while finishing her degree part-time. Meridian was a defense contractor that hired former military personnel as consultants, analysts, and strategic advisors. The pay was good. The work was interesting, if you were into that kind of thing. And the office culture was professional, structured, maybe a bit rigid compared to other corporate environments. But that made sense given the military backgrounds of most senior staff. Alan Johnson had been working at Meridian since his retirement from the Army in 2021. He was a senior consultant, brought in for his strategic expertise and his connections within the defense establishment. By all accounts, he was respected at work, maybe a bit intense, maybe a bit controlling about how projects were managed, but competent and professional. Rachel was assigned to his team as an administrative assistant in February 2023, helping coordinate meetings, manage documentation, handle logistics. Standard entry-level stuff. And at first, their relationship was entirely professional. Rachel would later describe Alan as extremely charismatic at work, respected by everyone for his military background and strategic thinking. He had a commanding presence, literally, given his rank, and a way of making people feel valued when he gave them his attention. He'd stop by Rachel's desk to thank her for her work on a project. He'd ask her opinion during team meetings, treating her input as important even though she was the most junior person in the room. It was flattering. It made her feel seen. And when he suggested they grab coffee to discuss a project she'd been helping with, it seemed perfectly innocent. Professional development. Mentorship, maybe. But coffee turned into lunch. Lunch turned into dinner. And by April 2023, they were involved in a relationship that had crossed well beyond professional boundaries. Rachel knew it was problematic. There were clear company policies against supervisor-subordinate relationships. But Alan was careful. He insisted they keep things private. Not because he was ashamed, he told her, but because he didn't want office politics to complicate what they had. He wanted to protect her from gossip, from accusations that she was getting preferential treatment. It sounded reasonable at the time. Looking back, Rachel would realize it was the first sign of how thoroughly Alan compartmentalized his life. Here's what Rachel knew about Alan Johnson's personal life in those early months. He was divorced. He had 4 children who lived with him full-time. His ex-wife, he said, had left the family years ago and had minimal involvement in the kids' lives. He described himself as a devoted single father, balancing a demanding career with the responsibilities of raising 4 children on his own. He spoke about the kids occasionally, their achievements mostly. Otto's academic excellence, Jack's athletic abilities, Liam's musical talent, Kai's artistic gifts. But his descriptions were always curiously detached, Rachel noticed. He talked about them the way you might talk about a project you were managing, proud of the results, but not particularly emotionally engaged with the process. Rachel found this a bit odd, but she also didn't have kids herself, didn't know what was normal for a single parent. And Alan had an explanation for everything. He was careful, he said, about introducing anyone new into his children's lives. They'd been through a lot with their mother leaving. They needed stability. He wanted to make sure his relationship with Rachel was serious and lasting before bringing her into that part of his world. It sounded thoughtful, protective, the actions of a good father who put his children's emotional well-being first. Except Rachel never met those children, never went to Alan's house, never saw him in full parenting mode. Their relationship existed entirely in her apartment, in hotels, in restaurants across town where they were unlikely to run into anyone from work. And when Rachel would ask, gently, not wanting to push, about when she might meet the kids, Alan would deflect. Soon, he'd say, let's just give it a little more time. I want everything to be right. By June 2023, they'd been together for about 4 months, and Rachel was starting to feel uncomfortable with the secrecy. She wasn't asking to move in or get engaged. She just wanted to feel like she was an actual part of his life rather than a compartmentalized secret. But every time she raised the issue, Alan would shift the conversation, promise they'd talk about it more seriously soon, and then change the subject to something else. Work, their plans for the weekend, anything but the question of when their relationship would stop existing in shadows. Then came July. Rachel missed her period, took a pregnancy test, then another one, then a third, because surely the first 2 were wrong. But they weren't wrong. She was pregnant, and she had absolutely no idea how to tell the man she'd been seeing, a man she cared about, maybe even loved, that they were going to have a baby together when she'd never even met his existing children, never even seen the house where he lived, never been fully integrated into his actual life. Rachel waited almost a month before telling Alan about the pregnancy. She was scared, confused, unsure how he'd react. Part of her hoped he'd be happy, that this would finally push him to bring her fully into his life. Another part feared he'd see it as a disaster, a complication to the carefully controlled existence he maintained. When she finally told him, early August, sitting in her apartment on a weeknight when he'd come over after putting his kids to bed, his reaction was neither joy nor panic. It was something worse. It was cold calculation. Alan went very still when she said the words. Just sat there, processing, his face revealing nothing. Then he said, "This complicates things. Not, this is wonderful, or we'll figure it out together, or even, I need time to think. Just, this complicates things." Like she'd told him about a scheduling conflict rather than a pregnancy. Rachel asked what he meant. He said they needed to consider all their options. She asked which options he was referring to. He said, quietly and without emotion, "You should think about whether this is the right time to bring a child into the world." Termination. He was suggesting termination. Rachel was stunned. Not because she was morally opposed to abortion. She believed in reproductive choice, but because of how clinically he presented it. No acknowledgement of what this meant emotionally. No consideration for what she might want. Just a tactical assessment. This pregnancy complicates the current situation, therefore we should consider eliminating the complication. Rachel told him she needed time to think. Alan nodded, said he understood, and left. For 3 days, she didn't hear from him. No calls, no texts, nothing. Like he'd just disconnected. And when he finally did reach out, it was as if a switch had flipped. Suddenly, he was talking about their future together, about fresh starts, about moving somewhere tropical, Costa Rica, specifically. He'd been looking at properties, he said, beautiful places near the beach, communities of American expats. They could start over there, build the life they wanted. No complications, no baggage, just them and their new baby living in paradise. It was intoxicating, in a way, this vision he painted. But there were massive gaps in the picture. When Rachel asked about his 4 existing children, Alan would get vague. They'd figure it out, he said. The details would work themselves out. Maybe the kids would stay with their mother. Maybe they'd visit sometimes. Maybe, and he never finished that sentence. Just trailed off and changed the subject. Throughout August and into early September, the tension between Rachel and Alan escalated. She was pregnant, dealing with morning sickness and hormonal changes, and the reality that she was going to become a mother. And the man who'd gotten her pregnant was talking about Costa Rica and fresh starts, but wouldn't give her straight answers about basic questions. Where would they live? How would they support themselves? What about his children? What about his ex-wife? Were they even actually divorced? Or had that been another convenient fiction? Because Rachel was starting to realize she'd been lied to. A lot. She'd done some digging. Nothing dramatic. Just basic internet searches, public records checks. And what she found didn't match the story Alan had told her. His divorce wasn't finalized. Wasn't even filed, as far as she could tell. He and Catherine Smith were separated, yes, but legally they were still married. He'd told Rachel he was divorced. That was a lie. He'd told her Catherine had abandoned the children and wanted nothing to do with them. But Rachel found a recent court filing. Catherine had filed for emergency custody review. That didn't sound like a woman who'd abandoned her kids. That sounded like a mother fighting to get them back. Confronting Alan about these discrepancies went exactly as you'd expect. He had explanations for everything. The divorce was technically in process. Catherine's custody filing was just her trying to manipulate him. The situation was complicated, and Rachel didn't understand the full context. But here's the thing. Those explanations felt hollow. Rachel's instincts were screaming that something was deeply wrong. She was 6 weeks pregnant, then 8 weeks, then 10, and she still hadn't met his children. Still hadn't seen his house. Still existed entirely in the shadows of his life. By early September, Rachel had made a decision. She loved Alan. Or at least, she loved who she thought he was. But she couldn't bring a child into this situation. Not with all the secrets. Not with all the lies. Not with a man who seemed more interested in escaping his current life than integrating her into it. She scheduled an appointment with her doctor for September 19th to discuss termination options. And on September 15th, frustrated and hurt and desperate for some kind of clarity, she sent Alan a text message that would change everything. "I can't do this anymore, Alan. If you don't fix your situation by the 18th, I'm getting the abortion and moving back to Denver. This is your last chance." Looking at those words now, knowing what happened, Rachel would give anything to take them back. She'd meant them as an ultimatum for honesty. Fix your situation, meaning stop lying, be truthful about your divorce status, introduce me to your children, make a concrete plan that includes all of us. The 18th was her doctor's appointment date. The deadline wasn't arbitrary or meant as pressure. It was just the day she'd scheduled to discuss medical options if Alan couldn't or wouldn't commit to building an honest future together. But Alan Johnson interpreted those words very differently. Or maybe he chose to interpret them differently because it gave him permission to do what he'd already been considering. Fix your situation by the 18th. In Alan's mind, his situation was his 4 children. The complications, the anchors, the obstacles standing between him and the fresh start Rachel represented. September 15th to September 18th. 3 days. That's how long Alan had to fix his situation. And during those 3 days, according to phone records, he and Rachel spoke frequently. She'd call to check in, to see if he'd made any progress on being honest with her, on introducing her to his kids, on making real plans. And Alan would reassure her. Everything was being handled, he'd say. He was taking care of the complications. By the 18th, everything would be resolved. Rachel had no idea what taking care of the complications actually meant. She thought maybe he was finally going to have a serious conversation with his children about their relationship. Maybe he was going to sit down with his ex-wife and formalize custody arrangements. Maybe he was going to come clean at work about their relationship, accept whatever professional consequences came with it. She thought he was finally going to integrate his life, to stop compartmentalizing. To be honest, on the evening of September 17th, the night before the murders, Alan called Rachel. They spoke for 47 minutes, the longest conversation they'd had in weeks. Rachel would later struggle to remember the details of that call, trauma and guilt obscuring her memory. But she recalled that Alan sounded calm, resolute. He told her that by tomorrow evening, everything would be resolved. They could move forward with their plans. Costa Rica, their new life, their baby. No more complications. Rachel asked what he'd decided about the children. Alan said he'd found a solution that would work for everyone. When she pressed for details, he told her to trust him. Some things were better explained in person, but she shouldn't worry. After the 18th, their path forward would be clear. Those words, "I found a solution that would work for everyone," would haunt Rachel for the rest of her life. Because the next day, September 18th, Alan Johnson sedated his 4 children and suffocated them one by one. And in his twisted, horrifically distorted logic, he genuinely seemed to believe he was solving the problem, eliminating the complications, clearing the path for the future he wanted with Rachel. September 18th passed without Rachel hearing from Alan. She'd expected him to call, to tell her how the conversation with his kids had gone, to share whatever resolution he'd reached. But her phone stayed silent. She tried calling him several times throughout the evening. No answer. She sent texts. No response. By midnight, she was worried, but figured maybe he was dealing with difficult family conversations and needed space. She'd give him until morning. The morning of September 19th, Rachel woke up feeling uneasy. Still no word from Alan. She called his office. They said he hadn't come in. She called his cell again. Straight to voicemail. Around noon, she started to panic. Something was wrong. She could feel it. But she had no way to check on him. She didn't know his address, didn't have contact information for any of his friends or family, didn't even know his ex-wife's name. She was completely locked out of that part of his life. Then, around 3 p.m., her phone rang. Unknown number. As she answered and found herself talking to Detective Noah Martinez from the Phoenix Police Department. He asked if she knew Alan Johnson. She said yes. He asked about the nature of their relationship. She said they'd been dating. He asked if she'd heard from Alan in the last 24 hours. She said no, and asked what this was about. There was a pause. Then Detective Martinez said he needed her to come down to the station to answer some questions. It was important. It was urgent. And it concerned Alan's children. Rachel's stomach dropped. She asked if the children were okay. Martinez said he couldn't discuss details over the phone, but she needed to come in immediately. Rachel drove to the Phoenix Police Department in a daze, her mind racing through possibilities. Had something happened to the kids? An accident? Were they hurt? Was Alan hurt? Nothing in her imagination came close to the truth she was about to learn. Detective Martinez met her at the station, took her to an interview room, and told her what had been discovered at the Johnson residence the previous day. 4 children. Dead. Apparent homicide. Their father missing and wanted for questioning. Rachel's first reaction was disbelief. Absolute, complete disbelief. There had to be a mistake. Alan would never. He couldn't. Those were his children. He loved them. This wasn't possible. But as Martinez walked her through the evidence, the timeline, the planning, the journals, the flight to Costa Rica, the horrifying reality began to sink in. And then Martinez showed her the text messages. Her messages, including the one from September 15th. If you don't fix your situation by the 18th, I'm getting the abortion and moving back to Denver. The detective's voice was gentle but direct. Miss Thomas, can you explain what you meant by fix your situation? Rachel struggled to speak through the shock and horror. She explained. She meant be honest, introduce her to his children, stop compartmentalizing his life. She never meant. She would never. The thought that her words could have been interpreted as permission or motivation for murder was incomprehensible. But Martinez had to ask, Miss Thomas, did Alan Johnson ever indicate to you that he was considering harming his children? No, never. Not once. He talked about Costa Rica, about starting fresh, about complications being resolved. But murder? Violence? She'd never imagined. Never even considered. How could she have known? How was she supposed to guess that when he said he'd found a solution, he meant he was going to kill 4 children? The interview lasted several hours. Rachel told Martinez everything. How she'd met Alan, how their relationship had developed, the pregnancy, the ultimatum, the phone calls leading up to September 18th. She handed over her phone so they could examine their text message history. She gave them access to her email. She held nothing back because she had nothing to hide. She'd been lied to, manipulated, kept in the dark about who Alan Johnson really was and what he was capable of. When the interview finally ended, Rachel walked out of that police station into a world that had fundamentally changed. She was pregnant with the child of a man who'd just murdered his 4 other children. She'd sent the text message that he'd apparently used as justification, or at least timing, for those murders. The media would soon discover her identity. Her face would be on the news. People would speculate about her role, her responsibility, whether she'd known or suspected or somehow enabled what Alan had done. The guilt was overwhelming. Intellectually, Rachel understood she wasn't responsible for Alan's actions. She hadn't pulled the trigger, or in this case, held the pillow. She hadn't known what he was planning. Her request for honesty wasn't an instruction to commit murder. But emotionally, she was drowning. Her children were dead, and her ultimatum had been the catalyst. That's how Alan had framed it in his journals. That's how the timeline aligned. And that burden was crushing. Rachel released a brief public statement through an attorney. I am devastated beyond words by the tragic deaths of Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai Johnson. I was involved in a relationship with their father, but I had no knowledge of his intentions and never imagined the horrifying actions he would take. My heart breaks for these innocent children and for their mother. I will cooperate fully with law enforcement and will carry the weight of this tragedy for the rest of my life. But a statement doesn't capture the full reality. Rachel Thomas, 6 months pregnant, sitting in her apartment surrounded by police protection because angry people on the internet had decided she was somehow culpable, grieving for 4 children she'd never met, terrified about bringing a baby into the world whose father was a family annihilator. That was her new reality. And the worst part? She genuinely cared about Alan, maybe even loved him. The version of him she'd known, anyway. The charismatic consultant who'd made her feel special and valued. But that version had been a carefully constructed facade. The real Alan Johnson, the one who could look at his 4 children and see obstacles rather than people, who could calculate their deaths like a military operation, who could sedate them and suffocate them, and then calmly pack his bags for Costa Rica. That was a stranger. A monster wearing the mask of the man she'd thought she knew. In the days following Alan's arrest, investigators tried to piece together exactly how Rachel fit into his plan. Had he been honest with her about anything? The answer seemed to be, selectively. He'd told her about his children's existence, but not about his controlling parenting style or Catherine's desperate attempts to gain custody. He'd told her he wanted a fresh start in Costa Rica, but not that he'd been systematically liquidating assets and researching escape routes for months. He'd told her the complications would be resolved, but not that his solution involved murder. Rachel had been a catalyst, yes, but not a conspirator. She'd represented possibility, a new relationship, a new child, a chance to redefine himself. But Alan's pathology ran far deeper than his relationship with her. The journals proved that. He'd been growing increasingly detached from his children for months before Rachel's pregnancy, describing them in progressively dehumanizing terms, viewing them as burdens rather than blessings. Rachel's ultimatum didn't create his homicidal ideation. It just provided a deadline for something he'd already been contemplating. Psychologists who later reviewed the case noted that men like Alan Johnson, narcissistic, controlling, incapable of authentic emotional connection, sometimes commit familicide when they perceive their carefully constructed life falling apart. It's not about depression or desperation. It's about control. When these men lose control of their family situation, when their dominance is threatened by custody battles or new relationships, or simply by children growing up and becoming independent, they sometimes choose to destroy everything rather than accept loss of control. The children aren't seen as human beings with their own rights and needs. They're extensions of the parent, possessions to be disposed of if they become inconvenient. Rachel Thomas didn't cause that pathology. She simply existed at the wrong time in Alan Johnson's psychological trajectory. If it hadn't been her ultimatum, it might have been Catherine's custody filing, or something else. Because when someone has decided that murder is an acceptable solution to their problems, when someone has reduced their children to variables in an equation, tragedy is inevitable. The only question is timing. As the case moved toward trial, Rachel would have to make a terrible decision. Testify against the father of her unborn child, relive the trauma of realizing she'd been dating a family annihilator, face public scrutiny and judgment, all while pregnant and grieving for children she'd never met. Or refuse to testify and live with the possibility that Alan might somehow avoid full accountability for his crimes. She chose to testify. For Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai. For Catherine. For her own child, who would someday need to understand who their father really was. But that testimony, that moment when she'd have to sit in a courtroom and face Alan across the room while explaining their relationship and her ultimatum to a jury, would be one of the hardest things she'd ever do. Because Rachel Thomas loved that baby growing inside her. And she hated Alan Johnson for what he'd done. And those two facts somehow had to coexist in the same reality. By late September 2023, the Phoenix Police Department and Maricopa County District Attorney's Office had assembled what prosecutors would later describe as one of the most comprehensive cases of premeditated murder they'd ever built. This wasn't a situation where investigators had to rely on circumstantial evidence and try to convince a jury that maybe, possibly, the defendant had committed the crime. No, this was a case where the defendant had essentially documented his own planning and execution of quadruple homicide in meticulous detail. The challenge wasn't proving Alan Johnson had killed his children. He'd left a paper trail and digital footprint that made that undeniable. The challenge was conveying the sheer calculated coldness of it all without the jury becoming so overwhelmed by horror that they couldn't function. Lead prosecutor Emma Wilson had been with the Maricopa County District Attorney's Homicide Bureau for 12 years. She'd tried murders, double murders, even a triple homicide involving a gang dispute. But she'd never handled a case quite like this. For children, killed by their own father, with months of planning, and evidence so extensive that organizing it all became a logistical challenge. By the time the preliminary hearing rolled around in early October, Wilson and her team had cataloged over 200 pieces of evidence: journals, computer files, financial records, phone logs, text messages, forensic reports, autopsy findings, witness statements. The story they told, when assembled chronologically, was almost operatic in its tragedy. A man's psychological descent from rigid control to homicidal calculation, documented in his own handwriting. Let's walk through the key pieces of evidence, because understanding what the prosecution had to work with helps explain why this case, despite the defense's best efforts, was almost unwinnable for Alan Johnson from the start. First and most damning, the journals. We've touched on these already, but it's worth emphasizing just how thoroughly Alan had documented his own thought process. These weren't ramblings or incoherent rants. They were organized, chronological entries that showed clear progression from dissatisfaction with his current life to active planning of his children's murders. Dr. Eleanor Hughes, a forensic psychologist who reviewed the journals for the prosecution, described them as a roadmap of premeditation. Every entry was dated. Many included times. Some even had subject headers like a business memo, options analysis, timeline considerations, resolution planning. The journals also revealed Alan's twisted rationalization process. He wasn't writing like someone who recognized he was contemplating evil. He wrote like someone solving a logical problem. One entry from August 22nd read, "Considered various outcomes. Option A, maintain status quo, fight custody battle, accept limitations on future planning. Result, continued burden, decreased autonomy. Rachel likely terminates pregnancy and relationship. Option B, relocate with children to Costa Rica, establish new life with Rachel. Result, enormous logistical complexity. Children would resist transition. Catherine would pursue international custody enforcement. Option C, eliminate primary obstacle to option B while removing children from equation entirely. Result, clean break, simplified future, no custody complications. Option C, that's what he called it. Not murder my 4 children, but eliminate primary obstacle. The language of corporate strategy applied to familicide. And that wasn't just one entry, it was a pattern throughout. Alan consistently used euphemistic, technical language to describe what he was planning. The children were complications, variables, legacy obligations. Their deaths were transition, resolution, protocol implementation. It was as if by using this language, he could distance himself from the human reality of what he was contemplating. Then there was the digital evidence. And this is where Alan's military intelligence background actually worked against him. He'd tried to cover his tracks, clearing browser history, using private browsing modes, even routing some searches through VPN services. But he'd underestimated modern forensic capabilities. Digital forensics expert Aidan Park spent 3 weeks extracting data from Alan's computers, phone, and cloud storage accounts. What he recovered was a chronicle of planning that spanned months. The search history told its own story. Park organized the searches into categories for the jury: escape planning, method research, legal exposure, and cover-up techniques. Under escape planning, Countries with no extradition treaty: United States. Costa Rica property for sale remote. How to establish new identity abroad. Can U.S. Marshals extradite from Costa Rica? Opening bank account: foreign country with cash. These searches dated back to June, well before Rachel's ultimatum, which suggested Alan had been considering flight long before he had an immediate trigger. Under method research, things got darker. Drug children peacefully. Benzodiazepine dosage for children. Can overdose sedative be detected in autopsy? How long unconscious after sedative? Suffocation time: lost consciousness. Do sleeping victims feel pain? Suffocation. Signs of asphyxiation visible on body. Can coroner determine if victim was sedated first? These searches intensified in early September and became highly specific in the days immediately before the murders. On September 16th, just 2 days before he killed his children, Alan searched exact dosage Xanax for 50-pound child to ensure unconsciousness and how to verify death without pulse detector. He was researching not just how to kill them, but how to kill them in a way that would appear peaceful, that would minimize suffering, not out of compassion, investigators believed, but to make the scene easier to stage and reduce physical evidence of struggle, and that would be difficult for investigators to detect as homicide initially. The legal exposure category was equally chilling. What happens custody case if children deceased? Does custody agreement terminate if children die? Can parent be charged if children die natural causes? How long to determine cause death? Statute of limitations: murder in Costa Rica. Is family murder extraditable offense? Alan wasn't just planning the murders. He was researching the legal consequences and how to minimize them. Undercover-up techniques. How long after death body temperature drops? When does rigor mortis set in? Can time of death be determined precisely? How to stage scene look natural death? Do police investigate deaths no signs of violence? He was literally studying how to make his children's murders look like something else, or at least how to complicate the investigation enough that he'd have time to flee the country before being identified as a suspect. Park also recovered deleted files from Alan's computer that were, somehow, even worse than the search history. One folder, created in mid-August and labeled Contingency Planning, contained several documents. One was titled Timeline and laid out a day-by-day schedule from September 15th through September 22nd, Rachel's ultimatum date through the day after his planned arrival in Costa Rica. September 18th was highlighted and included the notation, Execute primary objective. Evening optimal for timing. Ensure verification complete before proceeding to cleanup phase. Another document was titled Resource Allocation and was essentially a budget for his escape, including line items like Costa Rica property, $340,000, offshore accounts setup, $15,000, cash reserves for first year, $200,000, false documentation, $25,000, emergency contingency, $100,000. He'd planned his post-murder life like a business venture, calculating how much money he'd need to live comfortably in Costa Rica while avoiding extradition. Perhaps most disturbing was a document titled Simply Protocol, the same one found on the thumb drive in his carry-on bag at the airport. It was a step-by-step instruction manual Alan had apparently written for himself. 1,800 hours. Prepare medication mixture. Dosage calculations based on current body weights. Otto 52 pounds, Jack 51 pounds, Liam 48 pounds, Kai 42 pounds. Dissolve tablets in juice to mask taste. Use chocolate milk for younger two to ensure consumption. 1830 hours. Serve dinner with medication-infused beverages. Maintain normal conversation. Do not deviate from standard evening protocol to avoid suspicion if questioned later. 1915 hours. Verify sedation taking effect. Subjects should be drowsy, compliant, disoriented. If not, delay to phase 2 until adequate sedation achieved. 1945 hours. Move subjects to individual rooms. Position in beds with comfort items. This staging is critical for post-discovery narrative. 2000 hours. Begin phase 2. Start with youngest to oldest to minimize risk of alert from older children. Method: pillow application until cessation of respiration, approximately 3 to 5 minutes per subject. Verify absence of pulse and respiration before proceeding to next. 20-45 hours. Verification complete. Check scene for any inconsistencies. Ensure all subjects appear peaceful, no signs of struggle. 2,100 hours. Remove all evidence of preparation, medication bottles, residue, etc. Standard cleanup procedures. 2,130 hours. Final documentation. Confirm flight arrangements. Verify offshore account access. Review checklist. 2,200 hours. Depart for pre-arranged hotel near airport. Early check-in under alternate name to establish alibi distance from residence. Reading this document in court would later cause several jurors to visibly recoil. This wasn't the work of someone who'd snapped under pressure or experienced a psychological break. This was premeditation in its purest, most calculated form. Alan had written himself an instruction manual for murdering his children, complete with timing, contingencies, and cleanup procedures. The financial evidence told another story, one of systematic preparation for permanent flight. Forensic accountant Maya Patel had traced Alan's financial activities from June through September, and the pattern was unmistakable. This was a man liquidating his American life in preparation for disappearing. Patel presented her findings in chart form, showing the flow of money from legitimate accounts into increasingly obscure financial instruments. In June, Alan began selling stocks and bonds. Nothing suspicious on its own, but the amounts were substantial. By July, he'd liquidated nearly $800,000 in investments. That money didn't sit in his checking account, though. It was systematically moved. $200,000 to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, $150,000 to a bank in Belize, $340,000 used to purchase the Costa Rica property through a shell corporation, $50,000 converted to cryptocurrency, which he apparently believed would be untraceable, and the remaining amounts distributed across multiple safety deposit boxes and withdrawn as cash. He'd also taken steps to eliminate financial ties that could track him. In August, he'd paid off his mortgage, a $380,000 payoff that came from selling his retirement accounts early. He'd closed credit card accounts, canceled subscriptions, terminated insurance policies, sold his car, and purchased a used vehicle with cash that he later abandoned at the airport. Every financial connection to Alan Johnson, the person, was being systematically severed. The Costa Rica property purchase was particularly telling. Patel showed the jury documents revealing that the property was bought through Nuevos Comienzos Holdings LLC, a company registered in Panama with Alan listed as the beneficial owner under the name A.J. Jenkins. The property itself was remote, 40 acres in the mountains outside San Jose, accessed by dirt road, with a small house that had no close neighbors. Alan had even arranged for satellite internet installation, scheduled for October 1st, 2 weeks after his planned arrival. He was building an off-grid existence where he could live for years without anyone knowing his real identity or history. But here's where Alan's planning revealed an interesting blind spot. He'd been meticulous about covering his financial tracks, but he'd underestimated how quickly modern law enforcement could unravel those tracks with proper warrants and international cooperation. His offshore accounts? Financial investigators had located them within days of his arrest. The Shell Corporation? Panamanian authorities had provided documentation linking it directly to him. The cryptocurrency? Blockchain analysis had traced every transaction. Alan had been smart, but not smart enough. Or maybe he'd simply assumed he'd have more time. That by the time investigators pieced together his financial escape route, he'd already be untouchable in Costa Rica. The forensic evidence from the crime scene itself was heartbreaking in its precision. Dr. Layla Patel, the medical examiner, had performed autopsies on all 4 children. Her findings confirmed what investigators had suspected. All 4 had been sedated with a combination of benzodiazepines, specifically Xanax, which Alan had a prescription for and had filled at triple his normal dosage in early September, and diphenhydramine, over-the-counter Benadryl, purchased in bulk at 3 different pharmacies over a 2-week period. The toxicology reports showed lethal levels of sedation in all 4 children, enough to render them deeply unconscious, but not enough to kill them outright. Cause of death in each case was asphyxiation, specifically smothering. The pathology was consistent with someone placing a pillow or similar soft object over the face and applying pressure until breathing stopped. Dr. Patel testified that based on the lack of defensive wounds, the absence of bruising around the face and neck, and the toxicology findings, all 4 children had been unconscious when they were killed. They wouldn't have fought back, wouldn't have struggled, wouldn't have known what was happening. From a forensic standpoint, This suggested someone who had both the knowledge to sedate effectively and the physical capability to carry out suffocation methodically. The timing of deaths was particularly significant. Based on body temperature, rigor mortis, and stomach contents, Dr. Patel estimated that the children had died between 7 p.m. and 9:30 p.m. on September 18th, with approximately 20 to 30 minutes between each death. Kai, the youngest, appeared to have died first. Then Liam. Then Jack. Finally Otto, the oldest. The progression from youngest to oldest suggested deliberate sequencing rather than simultaneous action. Alan had killed them one at a time, with breaks in between. Methodical. Controlled. Following his protocol. The crime scene staging added another layer of horror. Each child had been positioned carefully in their bed, covers pulled up neatly to their chin, their favorite comfort item placed beside them. Kai with her stuffed elephant, Liam with his music box, Jack with his soccer medal, Otto with his astronomy book. FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Sophia Chun testified that this kind of staging is called undoing behavior, an attempt by the perpetrator to symbolically transform a violent act into something peaceful or natural. It's not uncommon in cases where a parent kills their children, she explained. The parent can't face the reality of what they've done, so they create a scene that looks like the children are simply sleeping. It's a form of psychological self-protection, but it also demonstrates awareness of wrongdoing. If Alan truly believed he was doing something merciful or necessary, why the need to make it look like natural death? The physical evidence from the house supported the prosecution's timeline perfectly. In the kitchen, investigators found 4 juice glasses with residue containing traces of the sedative mixture. The glasses had been rinsed but not washed. Alan had probably been in a hurry after confirming the children were dead, anxious to begin the cleanup phase. In the trash, they found empty pill bottles, 3 Xanax prescriptions that should have lasted months but were depleted in weeks, and several empty Benadryl boxes. In Alan's bedroom, they found his luggage, partially packed. A checklist on his nightstand listed items to bring: passport, cash, offshore account docs, property deed, new phone, emergency contacts, Spanish phrase book. All checked off except the last item, which suggests he'd been interrupted or simply hadn't finished packing when he left for the airport. In his home office, in addition to the computer with its damning search history, investigators found a wall calendar with September 18th circled in red ink and the notation Resolution Day. They found a folder labeled New Life, containing information about Costa Rica, school options for Rachel's baby, medical facilities, expat community contacts, real estate listings. They found printed maps of the property he'd purchased, with certain areas marked, apparently planning where to build additional structures or establish gardens. He'd been visualizing his post-murder life in detail. And then there was the letter to Catherine, the one that had prompted her to call for the welfare check. "You'll never get them back." 7 words, written in Alan's precise handwriting, postmarked September 17th. The letter had been sent from a mailbox near his office, according to surveillance footage recovered by investigators. The video showed Alan, dressed in his typical business attire, calmly dropping the letter in the box at 4:47 p.m. on September 17th, less than 24 hours before he would murder his children. He'd sent that letter knowing exactly what he was about to do, knowing that by the time Catherine received it, her children would be dead. It wasn't just a message, it was psychological torture delivered with military precision. But perhaps the most powerful evidence wasn't physical at all, it was testimonial. The prosecution had assembled a roster of witnesses who could speak to Alan's character, his parenting style, his relationship with his children, and his mindset in the weeks leading up to the murders. These witnesses painted a picture of a man for whom control was paramount, emotion was weakness, and other people, even his own children, were means to ends rather than beings with inherent value. Former nanny Grace Peters testified about the family operations manual, the rigid schedules, the punishment systems. She described children who were more like small soldiers than kids, who responded to their father with "yes, sir," and operated according to predetermined protocols for public appearances. She recounted the incident where Otto was punished for asking to attend an astronomy program, his telescope and books confiscated for a month. "What struck me most," Peters said, her voice heavy with regret, was that the general showed no anger during these interactions. He was coldly logical, as if he were training recruits rather than raising children. Neighbor Diane Martinez testified about the lack of spontaneous play, about overhearing Alan tell his 10-year-old son that failure to achieve excellence is a choice, and that second place is simply the first loser. She described watching Otto drop and do 50 push-ups without argument after disappointing his father, a trained response that suggested this was standard discipline in the Johnson household. Teachers from the children's school testified about the kids' anxiety around performance, their lack of normal peer interactions, their almost palpable fear of making mistakes. One teacher, Mrs. Callahan, broke down on the stand recounting how Liam had once asked her, with heartbreaking sincerity, if it was normal for kids to feel scared of disappointing their parents all the time. She'd reported the comment to the school counselor, who'd reached out to Alan. His response, according to documentation, "My children are being prepared for success in a competitive world. Emotional coddling serves no productive purpose." Alan's sister, Samantha Johnson, provided critical testimony about her brother's lifelong need for control, his inability to handle unpredictability, and his tendency to view relationships in transactional terms. She testified about calling Child Protective Services after visiting in December 2020, about watching her niece and nephew move through their father's house, like shadows of themselves, polite and accomplished, but without the spark or joy you expect in children. And she testified about Alan's escalating disconnection from the children in his final months, how he'd stopped even pretending emotional attachment in their phone calls, referring to them increasingly as responsibilities rather than family. Military colleagues provided a different angle on Alan's character. Lieutenant Colonel Sofia Rivera testified about his controlling leadership style, his inability to tolerate deviation from plans, his tendency to make subordinates feel utterly worthless with just a look or a few precisely chosen words when they disappointed him. Colonel Marcus Harris described Alan as someone with a remarkable capacity for making difficult decisions under pressure, but who became noticeably agitated when control was threatened or when plans needed to be changed unexpectedly. These testimonies weren't just character assassination. They were establishing a pattern. Alan Johnson's entire life, from childhood through military service to fatherhood, had been defined by rigid control needs. When that control was threatened, by Rachel's ultimatum, by Catherine's custody filing, by the simple reality that his children were growing up and becoming independent humans rather than extensions of himself, he didn't adapt. He didn't compromise. He didn't seek help. He eliminated the threat. And finally, there was Rachel Thomas herself. Her testimony would come during the actual trial rather than the preliminary hearing, but prosecutors had already secured her cooperation. She would testify about their relationship, about Alan's compartmentalization, about the pregnancy and the ultimatum. She would explain, tearfully, that she'd meant for him to integrate his life, not eliminate parts of it. She would describe the phone call on September 17th where Alan had assured her everything would be resolved by the 18th. And she would have to live with the knowledge that her words, innocently intended but catastrophically misinterpreted, had provided the timeline for 4 murders. By the end of the evidence-gathering phase, prosecutors had built a nearly insurmountable case. The journals documented planning. The digital evidence showed research and premeditation. The financial records proved escape preparations. The forensic evidence confirmed method and timing. And the witness testimony established pattern and motive. Every piece reinforced every other piece. There were no gaps, no ambiguities, no reasonable alternative explanations. The only question remaining was, what would the defense possibly argue in the face of all this evidence? How do you defend someone whose own words, own actions, own methodical planning had created a perfect record of premeditated quadruple murder? The answer: you don't defend what he did. You defend his mental state. You argue that someone who could plan and execute such acts couldn't possibly have been in control of their faculties. You claim psychological breakdown, trauma, dissociation, anything to suggest diminished capacity. Because when the evidence of guilt is this overwhelming, the only defense left is, yes, he did it, but he wasn't criminally responsible because he didn't truly understand what he was doing. That would be the strategy. And as we'll see in the next chapter, it was a strategy built on questionable psychological theories, contested expert testimony, and the desperate hope that a jury might prioritize sympathy over evidence. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. October 2023. By the time Alan Johnson's defense team had fully assessed the evidence against their client, they faced what criminal defense attorneys call an unwinnable fact pattern. The journals, the digital footprint, the financial planning, the staged crime scene, the attempted flight, all of it pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Alan Johnson had methodically planned and executed the murder of his 4 children with full awareness of what he was doing. No amount of courtroom theatrics or procedural maneuvering could change those facts. So the defense had to pivot. If you can't argue innocence, you argue diminished capacity. If you can't deny the act, you challenge the intent. If you can't save your client from conviction, you try to save him from the harshest possible sentence. Enter Richard Connolly, a former JAG officer turned private defense attorney with a reputation for taking on seemingly hopeless cases and finding unconventional angles. Connolly had defended military personnel accused of war crimes, had represented contractors accused of fraud, had even successfully argued diminished capacity in a case involving a veteran who'd committed assault during what was later determined to be a PTSD-induced flashback. When Alan's family contacted him, his sister Samantha, desperate to find someone who might be able to help her brother despite her horror at what he'd done, Connolly agreed to take the case. Not because he believed Alan was innocent, not because he thought what Alan had done was justified, but because he believed, genuinely, that even the worst crimes deserve rigorous defense, and because he saw an angle that might, just possibly, create reasonable doubt about criminal responsibility. The strategy was audacious in its simplicity. Concede that Alan killed his children, but argue that at the time of the murders, he was experiencing a catastrophic psychological breakdown that rendered him incapable of forming the specific intent required for first-degree murder. In legal terms, this is called an affirmative defense. You're not denying the defendant committed the act. You're arguing that due to mental illness or defect, the defendant lacked the mental state necessary for criminal culpability. It's a high bar to clear. You have to convince a jury that someone who displayed enough rational planning to research methods, liquidate assets, purchase international property, and attempt flight was simultaneously so psychologically impaired that they didn't truly understand the wrongfulness of their actions. But Connolly had seen the military psychological evaluations from Alan's service records. He'd read about the combat deployments, the high-stress command positions, the years of compartmentalizing violence and strategic decision-making in war zones. And he'd consulted with forensic psychiatrists who specialized in atypical PTSD presentations, particularly in high-functioning military officers who'd learned to mask symptoms so effectively that standard evaluations missed them. This became the foundation of the defense strategy. Alan Johnson was a decorated soldier whose undiagnosed and untreated PTSD, combined with the overwhelming stressors of single parenthood and his ex-wife's custody challenge, had triggered a dissociative episode during which he genuinely believed he was protecting his children rather than harming them. It was a theory, a controversial one that many mainstream psychiatrists would dispute, but it was something. And when you're defending quadruple child murder with overwhelming evidence of premeditation, something is better than nothing. The defense's case would rest heavily on expert testimony, because Alan himself had been unwilling to undergo court-ordered psychological evaluation. This was a strategic disaster, but also reflective of Alan's character. Even in custody, facing life in prison, he maintained rigid control over what he would and wouldn't submit to. The court couldn't force him to cooperate with psychiatric examination, which meant the defense had to rely on experts who could review existing records, interview Alan within the limits he'd allow, and extrapolate from there. It was building a psychological profile from fragments rather than comprehensive assessment. But it was all Connolly had to work with. The first expert the defense consulted was Major Dr. Elizabeth Reynolds, a military psychiatrist with extensive combat zone experience and specialization in trauma-related disorders in military personnel. Dr. Reynolds reviewed Alan's complete military file, including 20 years of periodic psychological evaluations, after-action reports from combat deployments, performance reviews, and personnel records. What she found was interesting, not because it showed obvious PTSD symptoms, but because it showed their conspicuous absence despite significant combat exposure. This is actually a common pattern in high-functioning officers, Dr. Reynolds explained to Connolly during their preparation sessions. The military culture, particularly at command levels, rewards stoicism and emotional control. Officers learn very quickly that showing psychological distress can derail your career, can cost you command positions, can mark you as weak or unreliable. So they develop exceptional coping mechanisms: compartmentalization, emotional suppression, rigid adherence to structure and protocol. These mechanisms work well in military contexts. They allow officers to function effectively in high-stress situations. But when those same officers transition to civilian life, when the external structure of military hierarchy disappears, those coping mechanisms can become maladaptive. The compartmentalization becomes pathological. The emotional suppression becomes complete detachment. And the rigid adherence to structure becomes an inability to tolerate any deviation from their carefully controlled environment. This became the framework for what Dr. Reynolds would testify was hyper-controlled response syndrome. Not an official diagnosis in the DSM-5, but a clinical pattern she'd observed in multiple high-ranking military officers who developed atypical PTSD presentations. According to this theory, Alan's need for absolute control over his family, his children's schedules, his life circumstances, that wasn't just personality or parenting style. It was a trauma response. His brain, having experienced the chaos and unpredictability of combat zones, had compensated by creating rigidly controlled environments at home. When that control was threatened by Rachel's ultimatum and Catherine's custody filing, his psychological defenses catastrophically collapsed. The problem with this theory, from a legal standpoint, was that it had to explain how someone experiencing psychological collapse could simultaneously engage in months of methodical planning. Dr. Reynolds' answer: compartmentalization. Alan's brain had essentially split into two operating systems, one that continued to function rationally for planning and logistics, and another that was experiencing increasingly delusional thinking about his children and his situation. In her view, the journals that prosecutors saw as evidence of cold calculation were actually evidence of dissociation, a man trying to apply logical frameworks to increasingly irrational thoughts as a way of maintaining the illusion of control even as his grip on reality slipped. The second expert the defense brought in was Dr. Martin Chun, a neuropsychologist specializing in traumatic brain injury. Dr. Chun had been permitted to conduct limited imaging studies on Alan approximately 3 months after his arrest. Not a comprehensive evaluation, but enough to identify any obvious structural abnormalities. What he found gave the defense another angle: subtle anomalies in Alan's prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex, areas associated with emotional regulation, impulse control, and moral reasoning. Dr. Chin's theory was that Alan had sustained one or more concussive injuries during his military service that had gone undetected and untreated. These injuries, though not severe enough to cause obvious cognitive impairment, could have contributed to personality changes, difficulty regulating emotions, impaired judgment, and in extreme cases, violent behavior that seemed out of character. The brain scan showed what Dr. Chun described as regions of decreased density consistent with prior traumatic injury. Though he acknowledged that pinpointing when such injuries might have occurred was impossible without baseline scans from before Alan's military service. The prosecution would later challenge this vigorously, pointing out that millions of people have minor brain abnormalities that never lead to violence, and that Alan had passed rigorous military neurological evaluations as recently as 2020. But for the defense, it was another piece of the puzzle, another way to argue that Alan's brain wasn't functioning normally, that his capacity for rational decision-making and moral reasoning had been compromised by factors beyond his control. The third and most critical expert was Dr. William Hargrove, a prominent forensic psychiatrist with decades of experience testifying in criminal cases. Dr. Hargrove had evaluated Alan in prison over several sessions, interviews that Alan had agreed to because they were for his own defense rather than court-ordered. Based on those interviews and his review of all available evidence, Dr. Hargrove developed the defense's central thesis. Alan Johnson had experienced what he termed catastrophic psychological decompensation, a severe breakdown in psychological functioning triggered by the convergence of multiple overwhelming stressors. In Dr. Hargrove's framework, Alan's carefully constructed psychological defenses, the compartmentalization, the rigid control, the emotional detachment that had allowed him to function as both a combat officer and a demanding parent, had held for years. But by summer 2023, those defenses were under siege from multiple directions simultaneously. Rachel's pregnancy represented unpredictability and loss of control. Catherine's custody filing represented a direct threat to his authority over his children. His retirement from the military had removed the external structure that had supported his coping mechanisms. And the ultimatum from Rachel, demanding integration of his compartmentalized life, was something his psyche literally couldn't process. In my professional opinion, Dr. Hargrove would later testify, Mr. Johnson experienced a form of psychological collapse in which his normally rigid control mechanisms failed catastrophically. In this dissociated state, he developed what I would characterize as a protective delusion, a distorted belief that his children would suffer terribly in the coming custody battle, that their lives would be destroyed by being torn between parents, that the only way to protect them from that suffering was to ensure they never experienced it. This is where the defense's theory got controversial. They were arguing that Alan genuinely believed, in his psychologically impaired state, that killing his children was an act of protection. Not murder, but mercy. Not destruction, but salvation. He'd convinced himself, according to this framework, that death was preferable to the chaos and suffering he imagined they'd endure if Catherine gained custody. The challenge with this defense was reconciling Alan's alleged dissociative state with his meticulous planning. How do you explain someone who's supposedly experiencing psychological breakdown simultaneously researching sedative dosages, creating detailed timelines, arranging offshore bank accounts, and writing himself step-by-step instructions for murder? The defense's answer was that compartmentalization allowed him to maintain rational functioning in some domains while experiencing delusional thinking in others. His training, his military background, his lifelong pattern of applying structure to chaos. All of that meant that even in crisis, he would instinctively revert to planning and protocol. Think of it like a computer running multiple programs, Dr. Reynolds explained during her testimony. One program is executing tactical planning. That's the part trained by 20 years of military service. Another program is experiencing severe psychological distress and developing delusional beliefs about protection and harm. These programs can run simultaneously in compartmentalized minds. Mr. Johnson's journals, which the prosecution presents as evidence of cold calculation, actually demonstrate this split. He's using military language and structured thinking to manage what is essentially a psychotic break from reality. It was creative, it was sophisticated, and it required the jury to accept a level of psychological complexity that most people, understandably, would struggle to believe. Because here's the thing about Alan's behavior. He didn't look like someone having a breakdown. He looked like someone executing a plan. When he was arrested at the airport, he was calm, composed, rational. When he spoke to detectives, he asserted his rights clearly and coherently. Throughout the preliminary hearing and trial, he maintained perfect posture, showed no signs of confusion or disorganization, and appeared to understand everything happening around him perfectly well. If this was a man who'd experienced catastrophic psychological decompensation, he'd apparently recovered quite thoroughly by the time of his arrest. The defense had an answer for that too. Dissociative episodes can be time-limited. Alan's breakdown occurred during a specific window, the days surrounding September 18th, and by the time he was arrested, his psychological functioning had stabilized, though he remained in denial about the full moral weight of his actions. But this explanation required the jury to believe in a remarkably convenient timeline. Alan was psychologically impaired enough to not be criminally responsible during the murders, but recovered enough to rationally execute his escape plan immediately afterward. As the case moved toward trial, the defense faced another major obstacle: Alan Johnson himself. Connolly strongly advised his client not to testify. The prosecution would eviscerate him on cross-examination. His lack of visible remorse, his continued rationalization of his actions, his clinical way of discussing his children even now, all of it would play terribly to a jury. But Alan insisted. He wanted to tell his story, to explain his thinking, to make the jury understand that from his perspective, he'd been solving a problem, protecting his children from what he genuinely believed would be greater suffering. Alan, Connolly told him during one preparation session, I need you to understand something. When you talk about eliminating complications and solving problems, when you describe your children as obstacles or variables, you sound exactly like what the prosecution is saying you are, a calculating killer who viewed his kids as inconveniences. If you're going to testify, you need to show emotion, grief, remorse, something that demonstrates you understand the magnitude of what you've done. But Alan couldn't, or wouldn't. Even in private sessions with his defense team, his effect remained flat. He spoke about his children in past tense with the same clinical detachment he'd shown in his journals. He maintained that his actions, while recognized by society as wrong, had been necessary from his perspective at the time. He couldn't fake the emotional display that might have helped his case, because genuine emotional connection seemed beyond his capacity. This presented Connolly with a terrible dilemma. His client was insisting on testifying, which was Alan's right, but putting him on the stand would likely seal his conviction. The defense's entire strategy depended on convincing the jury that Alan had been in the grip of psychological forces beyond his control, that he'd been suffering from trauma and dissociation that impaired his judgment. But Alan himself would undermine that narrative every time he opened his mouth. His precise language, his calm demeanor, his continued rationalization, all of it would make him appear exactly as the prosecution characterized him: a narcissistic, controlling man who'd made a calculated decision to murder his children when they became inconvenient to his desired future. The defense team also had to contend with the prosecution's rebuttal experts, who would systematically dismantle every psychological theory Connolly planned to present. Dr. Vanessa Ortiz, a forensic psychiatrist working with the prosecution, had reviewed the same records as Dr. Reynolds and Dr. Hargrove, but reached very different conclusions. In her assessment, Alan showed no evidence of PTSD, dissociation, or any other mental illness that would impair his criminal responsibility. Instead, she diagnosed him with narcissistic personality disorder with antisocial traits, a personality structure characterized by lack of empathy, exploitation of others, grandiosity, and an inflated sense of self-importance. Mr. Johnson's behavior is entirely consistent with someone who has narcissistic traits combined with exceptional capacity for compartmentalization, Dr. Ortiz would testify. But personality disorders, even severe ones, do not meet the legal threshold for insanity or diminished capacity. Mr. Johnson knew exactly what he was doing. He understood it was wrong, hence his elaborate efforts to escape consequences. He simply believed, as narcissists often do, that normal rules and moral considerations didn't apply to him. His children weren't seen as autonomous human beings with their own rights and value. They were extensions of himself, possessions he could dispose of when they no longer served his purposes. This was devastating to the defense because it reframed all their evidence in a different light. The journals weren't evidence of dissociation. They were evidence of narcissistic rationalization. The planning wasn't compartmentalized function during psychological breakdown. It was strategic thinking by someone whose moral compass was fundamentally broken. The clinical language Alan used wasn't trauma response. It was dehumanization. Everything the defense presented as evidence of mental illness, the prosecution's experts presented as evidence of personality pathology that, while disturbing, didn't excuse criminal responsibility. The prosecution would also hammer on the lack of any mental illness diagnosis during Alan's 20 years of military service. Regular psychological evaluations, post-deployment screenings, fitness for duty assessments. None of them had identified PTSD, dissociation, depression, or any other condition that might support the defense's theory. The military had evaluated Alan Johnson repeatedly with specifically designed tools meant to catch combat-related trauma, and he'd passed every time. Either the entire military mental health system had failed to detect his severe psychological impairment, which seemed unlikely, or he'd never had such impairment in the first place. As the trial date approached in January 2024, the defense team knew they were fighting uphill. Their best hope was to create enough doubt about Alan's mental state that the jury might convict him of second-degree murder or manslaughter rather than first-degree premeditated murder. That would at least spare him from the harshest sentencing guidelines. But even that seemed optimistic given the evidence. The strategy for trial was to front-load the expert testimony, establishing the psychological framework before the prosecution could poison the jury against it. Dr. Reynolds would testify first, explaining hyper-controlled response syndrome and how combat trauma manifests differently in high-functioning officers. Dr. Chun would follow, presenting the brain imaging evidence and discussing how traumatic brain injury can affect decision-making. Dr. Hargrove would be the anchor, synthesizing everything into a coherent narrative of catastrophic decompensation triggered by overwhelming stress. Then, Despite Connolly's misgivings, Allen would testify. He'd walk the jury through his military service, his approach to parenting, his relationship with Rachel, and the events leading up to September 18th. He'd attempt to explain, in his own words, how the convergence of stressors had pushed him to a breaking point where his perception of reality became distorted. He'd try to convey that when he killed his children, he genuinely believed he was protecting them from greater harm, a delusion born of psychological collapse rather than cold calculation. It was a risky strategy that depended on the jury accepting a complex psychological framework over their common-sense interpretation of the evidence. It required them to believe that someone could be simultaneously organized enough to plan an international escape and impaired enough to not understand the wrongfulness of murdering 4 children. It asked them to extend sympathy to a man who showed no visible remorse and who continued, even in custody, to rationalize his actions in clinical, detached language. And all of this had to be accomplished while the prosecution would be presenting overwhelming physical evidence, damning journal entries in Allen's own handwriting, devastating testimony from people who'd known the children, and emotional victim impact from Catherine Smith and Rachel Thomas. The defense wasn't just arguing against evidence. They were arguing against moral intuition, against the visceral human response to child murder, against every instinct that told jurors this man was a monster who deserved maximum punishment. In his private moments, Richard Connolly sometimes wondered whether he was doing the right thing defending Allen Johnson. Not in the legal sense. Everyone deserves competent defense. That's the bedrock of the justice system. But in the moral sense, was he helping a narcissistic killer avoid accountability by dressing up his pathology in psychological jargon? Was hyper-controlled response syndrome and catastrophic decompensation just fancy language for he's a controlling asshole who murdered his kids when they became inconvenient? But Connolly had seen enough cases to know that human psychology is complicated, that the line between evil and illness isn't always clear, that people can be both victims of their own broken brains and responsible for the terrible things they do. His job wasn't to decide Allen's moral culpability. That was for the jury. His job was to ensure Allen received a fair trial, that the psychological complexity got presented alongside the prosecutorial narrative, that the jury had all the information they needed to make an informed decision. Still, preparing for this trial weighed on him. Reading Allen's journals, looking at crime scene photos of 4 children arranged peacefully in their beds, interviewing Rachel Thomas and hearing her guilt-ridden testimony about the ultimatum, talking to Catherine Smith and seeing a mother destroyed by loss and the knowledge that she'd left her children in the care of their murderer. This case had no winners, only degrees of tragedy. The defense team worked late into December and early January, preparing jury instructions, anticipating prosecution arguments, rehearsing expert testimony. They filed motions to exclude certain evidence, the letter to Catherine, some of the more damning journal entries, Allen's internet search history, arguing that the prejudicial effect outweighed probative value. Most of these motions were denied. They requested a change of venue, arguing that pretrial publicity made a fair trial impossible in Maricopa County. Denied. They asked for the trial to be bifurcated, guilt phase separate from sentencing phase, to allow the mental health evidence to be heard without the pressure of an immediate verdict. Granted, at least. By the time jury selection began in early January, both sides knew this would be a media spectacle. The courtroom was packed daily. National news outlets sent correspondents. Court TV was broadcasting significant portions live. The case had become emblematic of something larger. Debates about PTSD and veterans, about toxic masculinity and controlling parenting, about how seemingly successful people can hide monstrous capabilities behind respectable facades. And at the center of it all sat Allen Johnson, former Army general, father of 4 murdered children, maintaining his rigid posture and controlled demeanor even as his defense attorneys tried desperately to convince a jury he'd been out of control when he killed them. The trial was about to begin. And despite the defense's sophisticated arguments and expert testimony, despite the thousands of hours of preparation and the carefully constructed psychological narrative, Richard Connolly suspected, feared, really, that it wouldn't be enough. Because at the end of the day, the jury would look at Allen Johnson and see a man who'd written detailed instructions for murdering his children, who'd sedated them and suffocated them one by one, who'd arranged their bodies like they were sleeping, and who then calmly attempted to flee to a country where he couldn't be extradited. And no amount of talk about trauma responses or dissociative episodes would change what that looked like. Premeditated murder. January 8, 2024. The first day of the trial of Arizona versus Alan Johnson. If you tried to get a seat in courtroom 6A of the Maricopa County Superior Courthouse that morning, you would have needed to arrive hours early. The line stretched down the hallway, around the corner, out the building's entrance. Media credentials had been issued to over 50 outlets, local, national, even international. Court TV had positioned cameras at every permissible angle. Outside, protesters held signs, some demanding justice for Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai, others debating military mental health care and veteran support. This wasn't just a trial. It had become a cultural moment, a referendum on toxic control, parental rights, and how we treat combat trauma. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Judge Victoria Sandoval, who'd taken over the case after the preliminary hearing, ran a famously efficient courtroom. No theatrics, no unnecessary delays, just methodical progression through evidence and testimony. She entered at precisely 9 a.m., and after handling several procedural matters, she invited the prosecution to begin opening statements. Emma Wilson approached the jury box with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing your case is rock solid. No flashy presentation, no dramatic gestures, just clear, methodical explanation of what the evidence would prove. She showed the jury photographs of Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai. Not crime scene photos, but school pictures. Bright faces, genuine smiles. Children who should have had decades of life ahead of them. Then she walked the jury through the timeline, the planning, the execution, the attempted escape. By the time she finished her 30-minute opening, several jurors were visibly emotional, and Alan Johnson sat stone-faced at the defense table, his military posture perfect despite the orange jail attire he'd been required to wear during trial. Richard Connolly's opening was more challenging. How do you ask a jury to sympathize with a man accused of killing 4 children? You don't really. Instead, you ask them to understand complexity, to recognize that horrible actions don't always spring from simple evil, to consider whether someone can be both guilty of an act and impaired in their responsibility for that act. Connolly spoke about Alan's military service, the combat deployments, the psychological toll of command responsibility. He introduced the concept of undiagnosed PTSD, of dissociative episodes, of a mind breaking under pressures it could no longer contain. He acknowledged that what Alan had done was horrific, but asked the jury to consider whether the legal definition of first-degree premeditated murder truly captured the psychological reality of what had happened. It was a competent opening, maybe even persuasive in abstract terms. But then you looked at Alan, calm, composed, showing no visible signs of trauma or breakdown, and the cognitive dissonance was jarring. This was supposed to be a man who'd experienced catastrophic psychological decompensation. He looked like a man in complete control of his faculties, slightly annoyed by the inconvenience of his trial. The prosecution's case unfolded over 2 weeks with devastating precision. Detective Noah Martinez testified about discovering the 4 children, about the methodical staging of the scene, about Alan's calm demeanor when arrested at the airport. Catherine Smith took the stand and told the jury about her controlling marriage, about the impossible choice she'd faced when leaving, about receiving the letter that said, "You'll never get them back," and knowing, with horrible certainty, that something was terribly wrong. Her testimony reduced several jurors to tears, and even Judge Sandoval had to call a brief recess to allow the courtroom to compose itself. Dr. Leila Patel, the medical examiner, walked the jury through her autopsy findings. She was clinical, professional, but the facts spoke for themselves. For children sedated. For children suffocated while unconscious. Deaths occurring approximately 20 to 30 minutes apart, youngest to oldest. Someone had taken their time. Someone had followed a sequence. Someone had checked each child was dead before moving to the next. The jury heard all of this in carefully clinical language, but the human horror beneath the medical terminology was impossible to ignore. The digital forensics testimony was perhaps the most damning. Aidan Park presented Alan's search history, dosage calculations for children, how long to suffocate, can asphyxiation be detected in autopsy, and the jury saw what prosecutors had always known. This was research. This was planning. This was a man systematically figuring out how to kill his children in a way that would appear peaceful and be difficult to investigate. Defense attorney Connolly objected repeatedly, arguing that searches could be interpreted multiple ways, but Judge Sandoval overruled. The context was clear. The timing was damning. This was direct evidence of premeditation. But the emotional peak of the prosecution's case came with Rachel Thomas's testimony. Now visibly pregnant, moving slowly to the witness stand, she was a living reminder that Alan had created new life even as he was destroying the lives he'd already created. Her testimony was heartbreaking, not just because of the content, but because of her visible guilt and grief. She explained the relationship, the pregnancy, the ultimatum. And then, voice-breaking, she said the words that would be quoted in every news report. I meant for him to fix his situation by being honest. I never imagined, I couldn't have imagined, that he would interpret that as permission to murder 4 children. I will carry that burden for the rest of my life. Connolly's cross-examination of Rachel was necessarily gentle. The jury's sympathy for her was palpable. He established that she'd never met Alan's children, had never been to his home, had been kept separate from that part of his life. He suggested that her ultimatum, whatever her intentions, had created pressure at a vulnerable time. But he couldn't push too hard without alienating the jury, and Rachel's genuine anguish was impossible to challenge. When she stepped down, you could see the weight she carried, a woman who'd asked for honesty and gotten tragedy in return. The prosecution's psychological experts systematically dismantled the defense's anticipated mental health arguments before the defense could even present them. Dr. Vanessa Ortiz testified about narcissistic personality disorder, explaining how individuals with these traits view others as extensions of themselves rather than autonomous beings. She explained compartmentalization not as a trauma response, but as a personality feature common in high-functioning narcissists who maintain different personas for different contexts. And she addressed Alan's military records directly. 20 years of regular psychological evaluations with no indication of PTSD, dissociation, or any other condition that would impair judgment or criminal responsibility. What we see instead is consistent feedback about his exceptional composure, his ability to make difficult decisions under pressure, and his tendency toward rigid control. These are personality traits, not symptoms of illness. FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Sophia Chun testified about the crime scene staging, the careful positioning of the children, the comfort items placed beside them. This is what we call undoing behavior, she explained. The perpetrator is attempting to symbolically transform a violent act into something peaceful. It demonstrates awareness of wrongdoing. If Mr. Johnson truly believed he was protecting his children, if he was in a delusional state where he saw death as merciful, why the need to make it look like natural sleep? This staging suggests someone who knew what they were doing was terrible and was trying to reframe it, even in their own mind, as something gentler than it was. By the end of the prosecution's case, the jury had seen and heard everything Emma Wilson had promised in her opening statement. The journals, the internet searches, the financial preparation for flight, the staged crime scene, the attempted escape, testimony from experts, from family, from people who'd known the children and witnessed their father's controlling behavior. It was comprehensive, it was damning, and it left virtually no room for reasonable doubt about what Alan had done or how deliberately he'd planned it. The defense knew they were in trouble, but they had no choice except to proceed with their strategy and hope that psychological complexity might create some doubt about criminal intent. The defense's case began on January 22 with Dr. Elizabeth Reynolds, the military psychiatrist who would testify about hyper-controlled response syndrome and atypical PTSD presentations. She was credible, well-credentialed, and spoke with authority about her decades of experience treating combat veterans. She explained how high-ranking officers sometimes mask psychological trauma, how compartmentalization becomes maladaptive, how rigid control needs can intensify until they become pathological. In the abstract, her testimony was compelling. It painted a picture of a man whose psychological defenses, built over 20 years of military service, had catastrophically failed under civilian stressors his training hadn't prepared him for. But then came Emma Wilson's cross-examination. And this is where the prosecution's preparation paid off. Wilson didn't attack Dr. Reynolds' credentials or experience. Instead, she focused on specifics. Dr. Reynolds, You've testified that Mr. Johnson was suffering from undiagnosed PTSD, but you never actually evaluated him for PTSD using standard diagnostic instruments, correct? Correct. And the military psychologists who did evaluate him regularly throughout his career found no evidence of PTSD, correct? Correct. So your diagnosis is based on retroactive review of records rather than direct clinical assessment? Yes. And this hyper-controlled response syndrome you've described, that's not a recognized diagnosis in the DSM-5, correct? Correct. It's a theoretical construct you're applying to explain Mr. Johnson's behavior? Yes. Wilson then presented Allen's performance reviews from his final years of military service. Exceptional marks, no concerns about judgment or decision-making, glowing assessments of his leadership and strategic thinking. Dr. Reynolds, if Mr. Johnson was suffering from severe psychological impairment, how do you explain his exceptional performance in cognitively demanding roles as recently as 2 years before these murders? Dr. Reynolds' answer, that compartmentalization allowed him to function in some domains while being impaired in others, sounded increasingly like special pleading. Wilson was systematically showing that every time the evidence didn't fit the defense's theory, they invoked compartmentalization as a catch-all explanation. Dr. Martin Chin's testimony about traumatic brain injury faced similar challenges. Yes, the brain scans showed minor abnormalities, but millions of people have such abnormalities without becoming violent. No, he couldn't definitively link these abnormalities to Allen's behavior. No, he couldn't determine when the injuries might have occurred. Yes, Allen had passed rigorous military neurological evaluations as recently as 2020. By the time Wilson finished her cross-examination, the brain injury theory looked more like speculation than science. The defense's anchor witness was Dr. William Hargrove, the forensic psychiatrist who'd conducted the most extensive evaluation of Allen in custody. Dr. Hargrove was an impressive figure, distinguished appearance, precise vocabulary, the kind of expert who commands respect in a courtroom. His testimony about catastrophic psychological decompensation was detailed and, to those inclined to believe it, persuasive. He described Allen's increasing stress, the convergence of multiple pressures, the development of what he characterized as a protective delusion. But Hargrove had a problem, Allen himself. When Wilson asked whether Allen had shown remorse during their sessions, Hargrove had to admit that remorse had been minimal. When she asked about Allen's continued rationalization of his actions, Hargrove acknowledged that Allen still viewed his decisions as, if not justified, at least understandable given the circumstances as he'd perceived them. When she asked about Allen's effect and demeanor, Hargrove had to describe him as remarkably controlled and composed, even when discussing the deaths of his children. Wilson's key question was devastating in its simplicity. Dr. Hargrove, you've testified that Mr. Johnson experienced a profound break from reality, a dissociative episode during which he genuinely believed he was protecting his children. But in all your sessions with him, in all your evaluation of his current mental state, have you found any evidence that he currently experiences delusions, hallucinations, or any other break from reality? No. So this psychological break was conveniently time-limited to the period during which he killed his children and attempted to flee to a non-extradition country. But he's been completely lucid before and since? That oversimplifies. Dr. Hargrove, yes or no? Is Mr. Johnson currently experiencing any symptoms of psychosis or dissociation? No. The implication was clear. If Allen's psychological breakdown was real, why did it magically resolve after he accomplished what he'd planned? The defense's answer, that dissociative episodes can be time-limited, sounded increasingly like they were constructing a theory to fit the evidence rather than following the evidence to a theory. And then came the decision that would seal Allen Johnson's fate. He insisted on testifying. Connolly had argued against it strenuously. Allen's lack of emotional effect, his continued rationalization, his clinical way of discussing his children, all of it would play terribly. But Allen believed he could make the jury understand that if he just explained his thinking, they'd see the logic. That his calmness and clarity would demonstrate he wasn't some monster, but a man who'd made terrible decisions under unbearable pressure. He was catastrophically wrong. Allen took the stand on January 29th, dressed in a suit rather than jail attire, his posture perfect, his voice steady. Connolly led him through his military background, his approach to parenting, his relationship with Rachel. Allen spoke in the same precise, controlled language he used in his journals. He described his children not with warmth or grief, but in terms of their achievements and the responsibilities they represented. When Connolly asked about the days leading up to September 18th, Allen explained that he'd felt increasingly overwhelmed by competing obligations and had begun to see only one solution that would resolve all variables satisfactorily. Variables. He called his children variables. And you could see the jury react, subtle shifts in posture, exchanged glances, furrowed brows. This was not a man showing remorse. This was not someone who seemed to grasp the magnitude of what he'd done. When Connolly asked if Allen understood that society viewed his actions as wrong, Allen said, "Yes, I recognize that my perspective is not shared by the legal system or by conventional moral frameworks. Not, I know what I did was terrible. Just acknowledgement that other people disagreed with his assessment." Emma Wilson's cross-examination was methodical and brutal. She walked Allen through his journal entries, asking him to read them aloud. "For lives standing between me and freedom." The simple mathematics of the situation becomes clearer. Option C. Eliminate primary obstacle. After each entry, she'd ask, "Mr. Johnson, does this sound like someone experiencing a psychological break or someone making calculated decisions?" Allen would try to explain the context, but his explanations only reinforced how rational his thinking had been. The cross-examination's climax came when Wilson displayed Allen's protocol document, the step-by-step instructions he'd written for murdering his children. She asked him to confirm he'd written it. He did. She asked him to explain how someone in the grip of dissociation and delusion could write such organized, detailed instructions. Allen said, "I've always approached complex problems with systematic planning. Even under stress, that's my default cognitive mode." "Mr. Johnson," Wilson said, her voice sharp, "you've testified that you believe killing your children was protecting them. But your protocol includes instructions for cleanup, for removing evidence, for establishing an alibi distance from your residence. If you truly believed you were doing something merciful and necessary, why the need to hide it? Why the elaborate escape plan? Why the research into countries without extradition? Those aren't the actions of someone in a delusional state. Those are the actions of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and wanted to avoid consequences." Allen's response, that he'd recognized society would misunderstand his actions even if he believed them justified, was perhaps the worst thing he could have said, because it demonstrated exactly what the prosecution had argued from the beginning. He knew it was wrong. He knew he'd be punished. He just thought the rules shouldn't apply to him. He'd made a choice, calculated the consequences, and planned his escape. That's not insanity. That's not diminished capacity. That's premeditated murder. When Allen stepped down from the witness stand after 6 hours of testimony, the defense knew their case was essentially lost. Allen's own words, his own effect, his continued inability to show genuine remorse or emotional connection to his dead children. It had undermined every psychological theory the defense experts had presented. The jury didn't see a man broken by trauma. They saw exactly what the prosecution had described: a controlling narcissist who'd murdered his children when they became obstacles to his desired future. Closing arguments came on February 1st. Emma Wilson was brief and powerful. She reminded the jury of Allen's own words, the simple mathematics of the situation. She displayed the protocol document again. She showed the timeline of his planning. And she asked the jury a simple question: does this look like a man who didn't understand what he was doing? Or does this look like a man who understood perfectly well and simply didn't care? She concluded with the school photographs of Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai. These children deserved to grow up. They deserved fathers who protected them, not murdered them. Justice demands you hold Allen Johnson fully accountable for deliberately ending for innocent lives. Richard Connolly did his best in closing to rehabilitate the defense's case. He reminded the jury about Dr. Reynolds' testimony about atypical PTSD, about Dr. Chen's brain injury findings, about Dr. Hargrove's catastrophic decompensation theory. He asked them to consider that horrible actions don't always spring from simple evil, that psychology is complex, that diminished capacity is a real legal concept that exists for situations exactly like this. But even as he spoke, you could see his heart wasn't fully in it. His client had destroyed the defense's best arguments by being himself on the stand. Judge Sandoval's jury instructions took nearly an hour. explaining the legal definitions of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, manslaughter, and the standards for diminished capacity defenses. She emphasized that the burden of proof remained with the prosecution, that the jury must be convinced beyond reasonable doubt, and that sympathy or emotion couldn't substitute for careful evaluation of evidence. The jury began deliberations at 4:45 p.m. on February 1st. Legal analysts predicted days of deliberation given the complexity of the case and the psychological testimony. But just 2 hours and 53 minutes later, at 7:38 p.m., the jury sent word they'd reached a verdict. 3 hours. For a case this complex, that was remarkably fast, and everyone in the courtroom knew what it meant. Quick verdicts in murder trials almost always favor the prosecution. The jury hadn't needed days to debate psychological theories. They'd looked at the evidence, listened to Alan's own testimony, and reached a conclusion. The courtroom was packed when Judge Sandoval reconvened at 8 p.m. Alan sat at the defense table, his military posture still perfect, but something in his eyes suggested he knew what was coming. Catherine Smith sat in the front row, flanked by family members, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Rachel Thomas, 7 months pregnant now, sat several rows back, her expression haunted. The jury foreman, a retired nurse in her 60s, stood when asked if they'd reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor. In the case of the state of Arizona versus Alan Johnson, on the charge of first-degree premeditated murder in the death of Otto Johnson, how do you find?" "We find the defendant guilty." Catherine Smith's suppressed sob was audible throughout the silent courtroom. "On the charge of first-degree premeditated murder in the death of Jack Johnson?" "Guilty." "On the charge of first-degree premeditated murder in the death of Liam Johnson?" "Guilty." "On the charge of first-degree premeditated murder in the death of Kai Johnson?" "Guilty." For guilty verdicts. On all counts. First-degree premeditated murder. The jury had rejected every aspect of the defense's diminished capacity argument. In their view, Alan Johnson had known exactly what he was doing, had planned it methodically, and bore full criminal responsibility for ending for innocent lives. Alan showed no visible reaction as the verdicts were read. No shock, no grief, no recognition of the magnitude of what had just happened. He simply sat there, perfectly still, perfectly controlled, as if this was happening to someone else. That lack of reaction, that continued emotional flatness, even in the face of conviction for murdering his own children, was perhaps the final confirmation that the jury had made the right call. This wasn't a man broken by trauma. This was a man whose fundamental inability to connect emotionally with others, including his own children, had made him capable of viewing their murders as acceptable solutions to his problems. Judge Sandoval thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later. As Alan was led from the courtroom by sheriff's deputies, Catherine Smith wept openly, supported by her sister. Outside the courthouse, the crowd that had gathered for the verdict released blue balloons into the night sky, one for each child. For bright points of color ascending into darkness, a community's way of honoring lives cut short by the one person who should have protected them above all others. The trial was over. Conviction secured. But justice, in the truest sense, remained elusive. Because no verdict, no sentence, no legal proceeding could restore what had been taken. For children were still dead. A mother would still spend the rest of her life knowing she'd left them in the care of their killer. A pregnant woman would still give birth to a child whose father was a family annihilator. And a community would still grapple with the question of how evil could hide behind such a respectable facade for so long. The verdict brought legal resolution, but emotional resolution, healing, closure, peace, that would remain forever beyond reach. February 16, 2024. 3 weeks after the guilty verdicts. Sentencing day. The courthouse was even more crowded than it had been for the verdict, if that was possible. Media vans lined the street. Security had been doubled. The public gallery was filled to capacity, with overflow rooms set up to accommodate everyone who wanted to witness this final chapter. Because this wasn't just about Alan Johnson anymore. This was about what kind of message society sends when a parent murders their own children. This was about whether the justice system could deliver something, anything, that approached actual justice in the face of such calculated evil. Judge Victoria Sandoval entered at precisely 10 a.m., and the courtroom fell immediately silent. She'd been a judge for 17 years, had presided over countless difficult cases, but you could see the weight of this one in her expression. Before we get to the actual sentencing, before we talk about the 290 years that would become shorthand for this case, we need to talk about the victim impact statements. Because this is where the human cost of Alan Johnson's actions became impossible to ignore. This is where the clinical language and legal proceedings gave way to raw grief and permanent loss. Catherine Smith approached the podium first. She'd maintained remarkable composure throughout the trial, but today she looked like someone barely holding herself together. Her hands shook as she unfolded her written statement, and her voice broke multiple times as she read. But she pushed through, because this was her last chance to speak for her children, to make sure the court understood not just that 4 children had died, but who they'd been and what the world had lost when they were taken. Your Honor, I stand before you today not only as the mother of 4 murdered children, but as the voice they can no longer use for themselves, she began. And then she told them about her children. Not just their achievements, though she mentioned Otto's astronomy dreams, Jack's soccer talent, Liam's piano mastery, Kai's artistic gifts, but who they were as people. How Otto would explain constellations to his younger siblings with such patience and enthusiasm. How Jack would practice soccer moves in the backyard even when he thought no one was watching, driven by pure love of the game. How Liam played Beethoven in secret because he wanted to surprise her. How Kai drew fantasy worlds where everyone was kind and no one was alone. Alan didn't just take their lives, Catherine continued, tears flowing freely now. He took their futures. He took first dates and graduations, career choices and weddings, grandchildren I will never hold. He stole not just the children they were, but the adults they would have become. Catherine's voice gained strength as she addressed Alan directly, turning slightly to look at him at the defense table. When I left our marriage in 2016, you told me that if I tried to take the children, you would make sure I never saw them again. I didn't realize then the terrible lengths to which you would go to keep that promise. The courtroom was absolutely still. I live every day with the guilt of leaving them with you. I made the impossible choice to leave temporarily so I could build a life stable enough to fight for custody. I spent 7 years preparing for that fight, and I was just weeks too late. Just weeks. If I'd filed sooner, if I'd been stronger earlier, maybe they'd still be alive. She paused, wiping her eyes, and when she spoke again her voice was filled with barely controlled rage. But I'm not the one who killed them. You are. You made the choice to see them as obstacles rather than human beings. You made the choice to drug them, to suffocate them one by one, to stage their bodies like props in your twisted narrative. You made the choice to try to escape accountability. Every choice in this horror story was yours, Alan. Mine was leaving them in what I thought were safe hands. Yours was turning those hands into weapons. Catherine concluded by addressing Judge Sandoval directly. There is no sentence long enough to restore what he has taken. But I ask the court to ensure that Alan Johnson spends the rest of his natural life in prison, with no possibility of ever again experiencing the freedom he so cruelly and permanently denied our children. She walked back to her seat supported by victim advocates, her statement having left barely a dry eye in the courtroom. Even hardened journalists were wiping away tears. This was grief in its purest, most devastating form. Samantha Johnson, Alan's sister, approached the podium next. Her position was complicated, loving her brother while being horrified by his actions, mourning her niece and nephews while grappling with genetic proximity to their killer. She'd been torn apart by this case in ways that were impossible to fully articulate. Your Honor, my brother sits before you convicted of murdering his 4 children, my niece and nephews, whom I loved deeply despite his efforts to limit my relationship with them, she began, her voice remarkably steady given the circumstances. I've struggled daily with the knowledge that I recognized Alan's controlling behavior as potentially harmful, but failed to intervene effectively enough to prevent this tragedy. Samantha described watching her niece and nephew at Christmas 2020, seeing them move through their father's house, like shadows of themselves, polite and accomplished, but without the spark or joy you expect in children. She talked about calling Child Protective Services, about her frustration when the investigation found everything technically fine. How do you report emotional sterility? How do you quantify the absence of love? Then Samantha did something surprising. She addressed her brother directly, turning to face him. Alan, I have spent months trying to understand how the brother I grew up with could commit such an unimaginable act. I've searched our childhood, our family history, your military experiences, looking for some explanation that would make sense of the senseless. Her voice hardened. But there is no explanation that suffices. No trauma or stress or mental illness that justifies what you did. You made a choice, a series of choices, that revealed your fundamental belief that your children were possessions rather than people, means to your ends rather than ends in themselves. Samantha's closing words were devastating in their finality. Whatever sentence the court imposes cannot approach justice for Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai. But I pray it ensures that you never again have the opportunity to control, manipulate, or harm another human being. You are my brother, but the man who could do what you did is a stranger to me, and I hope I never see you again. She walked away without looking back, severing the familial bond in the most public way possible. The courtroom held its collective breath as Rachel Thomas made her way to the podium. Now 8 months pregnant, moving slowly, she represented the painful complexity of this case. Another victim of Alan's manipulation, carrying a child who would be born into the shadow of their father's crimes. Her presence was controversial. Some people blamed her for the ultimatum, for pushing Alan over the edge. Others recognized her as another person he'd lied to, compartmentalized, used for his own purposes. Your Honor, I come before you today carrying the only surviving child of Alan Johnson, a child who will be born into a legacy of tragedy not of their own making. Rachel began, one hand resting protectively on her abdomen. I have struggled every day since September 18th with the knowledge that my ultimatum, however innocently intended, became part of the chain of events that led to the deaths of 4 innocent children. That is a burden I will carry for the rest of my life. She explained, voice breaking, how she'd meant for Alan to be honest, to integrate his life, to introduce her to his children and make concrete plans that included everyone. I never asked him to choose between his existing children and our unborn child. I asked for honesty and transparency. The idea that those children died because of my text message is something I will never fully process or accept. But I refuse to take responsibility for how he chose to interpret my words. Rachel then addressed Alan. Though unlike Catherine and Samantha, she didn't turn to look at him. Our child will be born in approximately 4 weeks. I have decided they will know about their siblings, about Otto's love of astronomy, Jack's athletic gifts, Liam's musical talent, and Kai's artistic spirit. They will know that part of their family history includes profound tragedy, but that tragedy does not define them. Her voice gained strength. What they will never know, if I can protect them from it, is the coldness with which their father calculated that some lives were worth more than others, that some children were obstacles while others were opportunities. No child should have to bear that knowledge about a parent. Rachel's statement was brief but powerful. She wasn't asking for a specific sentence. She was simply documenting the ripple effects of Alan's choices. Another life permanently altered. Another child who would grow up without a father because he'd chosen murder over honesty. Judge Sandoval called a brief recess after the victim impact statements, acknowledging the emotional weight of what had been heard. When court reconvened, she asked if the defendant wished to make a statement before sentencing. Richard Connolly leaned over to confer with Alan, clearly advising against it. But Alan rose, maintaining his perfect military posture, and addressed the court in that same measured, controlled voice that had characterized his testimony. Your Honor, I have been advised by counsel to express remorse and seek mercy from this court. I cannot in good conscience do either. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Sandoval called for order. Alan continued, seemingly oblivious to the reaction. I maintain that my actions, while judged criminal by this court and jury, were taken with the sincere belief that I was protecting my children from what I perceived as greater harm. The prosecution has characterized my decisions as selfish and calculating. I would describe them as necessary and merciful given the circumstances as I understood them at the time. Necessary. Merciful. Even now, even after conviction, even facing sentencing for the murder of his 4 children, Alan Johnson was rationalizing. He was reframing. He was applying that same clinical detachment that had allowed him to write step-by-step instructions for suffocating his kids. The jury had rejected his diminished capacity defense, but Alan apparently still believed in it. Or at least, he couldn't allow himself to fully confront what he'd done. I recognize that my perspective is not shared by this court or by society at large, Alan continued. I accept that there are consequences for actions that violate social and legal norms, regardless of the intent behind those actions. I do not seek mercy or special consideration. I ask only that this court acknowledge that my military service to this country was honorable and that prior to September 18, 2023, I fulfilled my duties as a father according to my understanding of what would best serve my children's development and future prospects. His statement concluded with a formal, "Thank you, Your Honor," as if he'd just presented a routine motion rather than defended murdering his children. Judge Sandoval sat in silence for a long moment after Alan's statement, reviewing her notes. Then she addressed him directly, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of moral authority that the law sometimes grants to judges in moments like this. "Mr. Johnson, the jury in this case has found you guilty of 4 counts of first-degree premeditated murder in the deaths of your children, Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai Johnson. I have considered the evidence presented at trial, the jury's verdict, the victim impact statements heard today, your own statement, and all relevant factors under Arizona law." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze fixed on Alan. "Before pronouncing sentence, I wish to address several aspects of this case that I find particularly disturbing. Throughout this trial and again in your statement today, you have attempted to frame the murders of your children as acts of protection or mercy." Judge Sandoval's voice gained intensity. "Your journals, your digital records, and your actions reveal not a father protecting his children from harm, but a man eliminating what he had come to see as impediments to his desired future. This calculated redefinition of murder as mercy represents a moral distortion that the court finds particularly reprehensible. The court also notes the extraordinary breach of trust these crimes represent. Children naturally and necessarily trust their parents for protection, nurturing, and guidance. You exploited that trust in the most fundamental way possible." She addressed his military service directly. "The court acknowledges your military service to this country, Mr. Johnson. However, rather than mitigating your crimes, I find that your military background aggravates them in several respects. You utilized skills and knowledge gained through your military training, discipline, planning, tactical thinking, to commit and attempt to escape accountability for these murders. Moreover, you have repeatedly invoked military concepts to rationalize the killing of your own children, suggesting that you view the taking of human life through a lens so detached from normal human empathy and moral reasoning that it raises serious concerns about your capacity for rehabilitation." The courtroom was absolutely silent as Judge Sandoval prepared to pronounce sentence. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The formal accounting, the societal response to Alan Johnson's calculated destruction of 4 innocent lives. Alan Johnson, having been found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree premeditated murder, and the court having found multiple aggravating factors and no significant mitigating factors, it is the judgment and sentence of this court that you be committed to the Arizona Department of Corrections for consecutive terms of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for each count, for a total of 4 consecutive life sentences. Judge Sandoval continued. "For the record, that constitutes a 290-year sentence, ensuring that you will spend the remainder of your natural life incarcerated and will never have the opportunity to pose a danger to society again." The 290 years wasn't literal. It was symbolic, a rough calculation of 4 life sentences at roughly 72.5 years each. But the number would become shorthand for the case, appearing in every headline. Ex-general sentenced to 290 years for killing 4 children. Judge Sandoval concluded with a statement directed not at Alan, but at the victims and those who mourned them. "No sentence this court could impose can restore the lives of Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai Johnson or adequately measure the loss their deaths represent, not just to their family and community, but to a world that will never know what contributions they might have made, what joy they might have brought, what lives they might have touched. The court can only ensure that justice, as our legal system defines and limits it, is served through the defendant's permanent removal from society and the clear message that no rationalization, no matter how elaborately constructed, can justify or excuse the taking of innocent lives." As sheriff's deputies moved to escort Alan Johnson from the courtroom for the last time, something shifted in his expression. Not remorse exactly, not grief, But perhaps the first glimmer of recognition that his carefully constructed worldview had been decisively rejected by the society he'd have to spend the rest of his life confined within. His military bearing remained, his posture still perfect, but for just a moment his eyes met Catherine Smith's across the courtroom. What passed between them in that moment is impossible to say. The mother and the murderer. The woman who'd left to save herself and the man who destroyed what she loved most. In the days and weeks following the sentencing, the case became fodder for analysis from every conceivable angle. Mental health professionals debated whether the defense's psychological theories had merit or were sophisticated justifications for narcissistic violence. Military experts discussed how combat trauma manifests and whether the system does enough to identify and treat high-functioning officers with atypical PTSD presentations. Family law advocates examined how Catherine's situation, leaving her children with an abuser because she lacked resources to fight him legally, reflected systemic failures in custody proceedings. True crime documentaries began production. Books were planned. The case was studied in law schools as an example of premeditation, in psychology programs as a case study in narcissistic personality disorder, in criminology courses as an illustration of family annihilation motivated by control needs rather than suicidal ideation. Alan Johnson became a name everyone knew, synonymous with a particular kind of evil, not passionate or impulsive, but calculated and cold. But amid all the analysis and discussion, for children remained dead. That was the inescapable reality. Otto would never discover a planet. Jack would never play professional soccer. Liam would never perform concert piano. Kai would never illustrate children's books. Their potential, all those possible futures, all those contributions to the world, all those people they would have become, was gone. Extinguished by a father who decided his children were acceptable losses in pursuit of a fresh start. Alan Johnson's 290-year sentence meant he would die in prison. Given his age and the mandatory consecutive structure of his sentence, there was no legal mechanism by which he could ever be released. He was 46 at sentencing. Even living to 90 would give him only 44 years served of a 290-year sentence. The mathematics he'd been so fond of in his journals had turned against him in the most literal way. In Arizona State Prison, Alan was placed in protective custody, not because authorities sympathized with him, but because child killers face particular danger from other inmates. Even in prison, where moral standards might seem relative, harming children is considered beyond the pale. Alan would spend his remaining decades isolated, his military rank and achievements meaningless in a context where the only reputation that mattered was the general who murdered his kids. Years would pass. In April 2024, Rachel Thomas gave birth to Hope Johnson Thomas. She kept Alan's last name for the baby because, whatever else was true, he was the biological father. Hope was healthy, beautiful, and loved with a fierce protectiveness born from Rachel's knowledge of what fathers can do when they stop seeing children as human beings. Rachel moved back to Denver to be near her family, changed her phone number, locked down her social media, and built a new life focused on giving Hope everything Alan's first 4 children had been denied: unconditional love, emotional safety, the freedom to be imperfect and still be cherished. Catherine Smith threw herself into the foundation work, channeling her grief into action. The Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai Foundation focused on 3 areas: supporting mothers trying to escape controlling relationships, improving family court procedures to better identify coercive control as abuse, and funding research into early warning signs of family violence. She spoke at conferences, testified before legislative committees, and became an advocate for other parents who'd lost children to family annihilators. The work didn't heal her. Nothing could, but it gave her purpose, a way to ensure her children's deaths weren't completely meaningless. Samantha Johnson never contacted her brother again. She attended the first few parole eligibility hearings. Not that Alan would ever actually be paroled, but in Arizona, even those serving life without parole get pro forma reviews every few years to ensure he never, ever received sympathetic consideration. She provided victim impact statements via video at each hearing, reminding the board exactly what Alan had done, exactly why he could never be safely released. It was her penance, she said, for not having done more to protect her niece and nephews when they were alive. The house on Saguaro Lane where the murders occurred was eventually sold, at a significant loss, because houses where terrible things happen carry that history like a stain. The new owners gutted and renovated it completely, trying to erase the ghosts. Whether they succeeded is a question only they can answer. The neighborhood memorial remained, maintained by community members who'd never met the Johnson children but felt their loss nonetheless. In prison, Alan Johnson maintained his rigid discipline and emotional control. He followed rules, participated in required programs, and kept to himself. Prison psychologists who evaluated him periodically noted his remarkable lack of introspection regarding his offenses and continued minimization of responsibility through intellectualized defense mechanisms. In layman's terms, he still didn't get it, still didn't grasp, or wouldn't allow himself to grasp, the full moral weight of what he'd done. He wrote letters occasionally, to his attorney, to his sister, which she returned unopened, to military colleagues, most of whom never responded. The letters were clinical, detached, focused on appeals and legal arguments rather than any genuine reckoning with his crimes. His appeals were uniformly unsuccessful. The evidence against him was too overwhelming, the procedural conduct of his trial too proper, the jury's verdict too well supported by the record. No appellate court was going to overturn this conviction, as years turned into decades. And yes, Alan Johnson is still alive as of the writing of this script, still serving his 290-year sentence, still maintaining that what he did was necessary and merciful. His case remained a touchstone for discussions about family violence, military mental health, and the psychology of family annihilators. New cases would occur, because tragically, Alan Johnson wasn't unique, just unusually well documented, and they'd be compared to his. The clinical planning, the rationalization, the complete inability to see victims as human beings rather than obstacles. But for those who knew Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai personally, the case was never about psychology or legal precedent. It was about 4 specific children with specific dreams and specific potential who should have had 80 years ahead of them, but got 10 instead. It was about a mother who'd left to save herself and lost everything anyway. It was about a pregnant woman whose request for honesty triggered a tragedy she'd never forgive herself for, even though she bore no actual culpability. It was about a community that had to grapple with the reality that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like decorated generals with perfect posture and military medals. The final words should belong not to Alan Johnson, not to the lawyers or judges or experts, but to the children whose voices were silenced. We know what they might have become from the glimpses we got of who they were. Otto, who could name every constellation and wanted to discover new planets. Jack, whose footwork on the soccer field showed instinctive brilliance. Liam, who practiced Beethoven in secret to surprise his mother. Kai, who drew fantasy worlds where everyone was kind and no one was alone. Their legacy isn't just the cautionary tale of their father's evil. It's the potential they represented. Every life they might have touched. Every contribution they might have made. Every person they might have become. That's what Alan Johnson took when he decided his children were acceptable sacrifices to his desired future. Not just 4 lives, but all the life that should have radiated from those lives. Children, grandchildren, students they might have taught, patients they might have healed, art they might have created, discoveries they might have made. The 290-year sentence was justice in the legal sense. But justice in the cosmic sense, the kind that would actually balance what was taken with what was given in return, that remains forever impossible. You can't sentence someone to 290 years in a way that brings back 4 children. You can't imprison someone so thoroughly that it undoes their crimes. All you can do is remove them from society, mark clearly that what they did was unacceptable, and try to ensure their case prevents future tragedies. So Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai Johnson remain 10, 9, and 8 years old, forever young in memory, forever present in the foundation that bears their names, forever represented by 4 blue balloons rising into the Phoenix sky every September 18th, when the community gathers to remember what was lost and commit to protecting other children from meeting the same fate. Their father will die in prison. That much is certain, and when he does, he'll have served perhaps 30 or 40 years of his 290-year sentence. The rest of the sentence is symbolic, society's way of saying these lives mattered so much that the punishment must exceed a human lifespan to even begin approaching proportionate justice. But the children will still be gone. And that's the tragedy no sentence can address, no amount of prison time can fix. Otto will never discover his planet. Jack will never score his championship goal. Liam will never perform his concert. Kai will never illustrate her book. And the world is poorer for their absence. The case of Alan Johnson represents one of those rare intersections where individual pathology, systemic failures, and pure tragedy converge into a horror that defies easy explanation. He was a decorated officer who became a family annihilator, a father who saw his children as obstacles, a planner who documented his own path to murder with military precision. But beyond the psychological analysis and legal proceedings, beyond the 290-year sentence that made headlines, for children lost their lives to a father who valued control more than love. Their memory, preserved through Catherine's foundation work and community commitment, stands as both warning and tribute, a reminder that the most dangerous violence often comes from those we're taught to trust most completely, and that protecting children requires vigilance even, especially, when the threat comes from inside their own home. May Otto, Jack, Liam, and Kai rest in peace, and may their story prevent even one future tragedy. Thank you for following this deeply difficult case with me. If you found this documentary valuable, please like, subscribe, and share it with others who might benefit from understanding how family violence can hide behind respectable facades. And if you or someone you know is experiencing controlling or abusive behavior in a relationship, please reach out to the National Domestic Violence Hotline or local resources. You're not alone, and help is available.